Welcome, everyone, to our Northern California MUFON meeting for Marin and Sonoma County chapter. I'm so happy to have you here. My name's Lorien Fenton, and our guest today is Dr. Simeon Hein. And he is just, oh my God, where do I even begin? I met Simeon at an SSE conference back in 2017, was it, or 16, something like that. And Melinda Leslie, my good friend Melinda, as you guys all know Melinda, introduced me to him. And there's the emotional support Sasquatch animal running through the background there. You'll see him periodically, or her. And she is an amazing dog. She can find Sasquatch at the drop of a hat, I'm telling you. Anyhow, so long story short, when I met Simeon, it was a great event we had at SSE, but to cap it off, I got to tell you guys, we got to get on a tour bus and go over and tour Bigelow Aerospace. And this is back in their heyday. And Simeon, I don't know if you remember this, but remember the two burly guys that got on the bus with the alien insignia on their jackets and everything? Yeah. And they were checking ID, and it was like going to a foreign country. I practically had a passport.
I got a picture of them. You were sitting right behind me, I think, and I got a photo of them. And
yeah,
I asked that guy, one of them. I said, "Are there? We read this article in the Times just a couple weeks ago, right, or previously, about there being a secret building here with ET materials."
That's right. And it turned out there actually was, but we didn't find out for a couple years later.
His response was, "I can't talk about it, but I'll just say there's some buildings that I'm not even allowed in here." And he's security. He's top security. So that was a yes to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was pretty wild. I got to tell you.
2018. It was 2018.
Was it 2018? Yeah. So anyhow, we get inside the building, and Melinda and I are like, "Oh my God, Bob Bigelow standing in the center of the room." He was there to greet us all, which was so amazing. And Melinda and I, of course, shoved our way to the front. I think we're the first people to shake his hand. And I don't know if you heard this, Simeon, because I think you were a couple people behind me. But I said to Robert, I said, "Mr. Bigelow, it's so amazing to meet you. I just want to let you know, I talk about you in every conference I present at. You are the focus of my presentation." And he looked at me and smiled, but then he turned around and looked at his PR lady like he was going to kill her for not knowing that there's some wild and crazy woman out there doing presentations about Bob Bigelow. Anyhow, it was pretty cute. And then we got to tour the facility, which was mind-boggling. I mean, the place was extraordinary. And so I'm sure we both had a great time. It was really cool. It was really cool.
Yeah. That was an amazing experience. I'll never forget my conversations inside that building with our tour leaders and other attendees.
Yeah, it was wild. Colm Kelleher was one of the tour leaders, and some of the most amazing people in ufology. John Alexander was there, and I think Robert Powell, and
yes,
I mean, it was the who's who of ufology over there.
It was.
Yeah, that was wild. Someday I'll dig up my pictures from that event. I saved all the ones that were on the website, by the way.
It's on my YouTube video, and I'll mention it when it's in my talk here. So.
Oh, cool. Great.
A tiny little bit. I'll mention it.
Anyhow, this is the end of my introduction for Simeon, and I'm going to let you guys have at it. He's got a great PowerPoint presentation for you. He's going to tell you all about himself and his little doggy too, just like the Wicked Witch said. And you guys are ready to rock and roll. So enjoy Simeon Hein's presentation.
Hey, well, thanks very much, Lorien. I'm afraid my dog has just picked up the noisiest dog toy in the world, so we're going to confiscate it, because otherwise he's going to, hey, look at this, we're having a dog attack here. Somehow all the toys end up underneath the desk here. Any case, that is, as Lorien said, my emotional Squatch animal from the Navajo reservation area where I actually used to work. It's interesting. You wonder what experiences in your life led to your interest now, and spending a couple months with the Navajo, with non-English speaking Navajo, just being around Navajo 24/7 for 2 months during college was an interesting. I mean, it was fascinating to be around natives to the United States who've been here a lot longer than we've been here, with their sense of time and space and cosmology. It was really interesting. So, in any case, just my background, and thanks for having me. My background is as a sociology teacher, sociologist. I used to teach statistics. I'm not a physicist or an engineer. So the ideas I'm going to present you are from a layman's perspective. Did the best I can do to understand these topics. And fortunately, more people are talking about these topics, as you'll hear in a moment. So what I want to share with you today is my understanding of a lot of how these phenomena that we call paranormal are connected. A lot of the same symptomology, phenomenology around very different phenomena. It's not something I ever expected would happen. But it turns out that a lot of these topics are highly interconnected. And as I've learned in the past few years, connected to the topics of cold fusion, so-called in the past, now called LENR, low energy nuclear reaction. And so what we know now is that there's been a huge body of knowledge that has really been censored out of our formal sense of reality that we learned in school. I think all of us here on the call went to the same type of school systems where we were taught what's real, what's not real. And my feeling now is that it's been heavily edited since the late 40s and 1950s for those of you here in the US. People like Alexander Unsicker, who has a physics YouTube channel, has written a lot of books about this. Something happened in the US where these topics were deleted out of our discussions in physics. So it ended up being very nuts and bolts and bigger is better and really large scale programs that didn't really delve deeply into the fundamental questions of physics. And it's just sort of gotten worse and worse and worse over the years, so that the topics we're going to talk about tonight, I hope I can shed some new light for you on what some of the fundamental principles that make them work, what some of those principles are. And what I want to show you is that there are other states of matter beyond the ordinary states of matter that we've all been taught about. And for some reason here in the United States, I have never heard about this until very recently, when I came across Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, the work of Bob Grenier, Hank Urey, and other people who are part of that nonprofit, to look behind the science of the Fleischmann and Pons cold fusion experiments. And it turned out that fundamental idea goes way deep into reality and how nature works and what makes us work and living systems work. But to me, I mean, think about it. The biggest mystery, I think about this all the time. I'm sure you do too, in various ways. We have no discussion of the topics that I'm about to present to you right now. These are all formally special access programs, classified research within Black budget programs within the Department of Defense and various intelligence agencies and other agencies that we're just learning about now since Congress has started looking into these topics. So it's like coming across this cornucopia of phenomena that literally there has been no discussion about. And so let's look at some of these topics. Now, these are my points of view on these topics. You might have other points of view, and that's fine. I'm just going to share with you my experience. And then after we're done in an hour or so, I'm welcome to hear your points of view and questions. So, Lorien, can I share my screen on my own here? I guess so. All
There
right.
we go. Now we're cooking.
Okay. How's that looking?
Yay, it looks great.
Okay. So, folks, we're going to look at a lot of these different topics and orbs, how it's connected to ball lightning,
Uh-oh.
UFOs. Excuse me, that should be cryptids, Bigfoot, and crop circles. Okay. So, thanks for listening. So, where did this start for me? People often ask me this. How did I get involved in this topic? How am I so curious about it? Back in the 1970s, my mom took me down to the Everglades. She was a bird watcher. She didn't take my brother or my dad. It's just the two of us went down. We were in the Everglades, very southern part of Florida. And all of a sudden, I looked up and there was something the size of a full moon right over us, maybe a mile or two up. And I said, Mom, look at the full moon. And well, the full moon was on the horizon. So she kept looking that way and then looked back at her binoculars. I said, no, yeah, Mom, look at this. He said, well, the moon's over there. I said, well, what's that? And we both had binoculars. And it was this big green amorphous object, perfectly round. But within it, with the binoculars, you could see structure, little definite solid structure. And as soon as we started to look at it, it started to move from completely stationary, which is why I thought it was the moon originally, stationary, and accelerated into a cloud. And it was like an increasing acceleration. So it moved pretty quickly into a cloud, disappeared. And she said, Sim, it's a UFO. And we both saw it and it disappeared. So we decided to go to the ranger talk shortly thereafter. The whole area was blacked out. And we sat in the front row at one of those amphitheaters they have at national parks. And the ranger said, did anybody see anything interesting today? And my mom, being the intrepid soul she was, raised her hand and said, we saw a UFO, and the people sitting next to us had seen it. And the ranger said, did anybody else see anything interesting today? Completely wanted to dodge the topic. So after the talk, my mom said, look, there's a blackout. We really did see this. And the ranger said, it's probably a weather balloon or Venus, or she didn't say that, but that's what she was suggesting. So I could see, even from that young age of around 12 years old, that there were phenomena out there that you could go to someone in authority, in charge, in this case in the national park, and they weren't going to talk to you about it. So after that time, I didn't really follow up with these topics, occasionally reading a book here and there, Mothman Prophecies, John Keel, books that sometimes teenagers find in libraries and read. And I did not hear about the UFO topic or any really topics that we're going to talk about right now, all the way from that time on in high school, all the way through college, master's degree, PhD. Never heard anything about any of these topics, but I think it was there at the back of my mind. Oh, there we go. What I did get involved with in graduate school was the topic of fractal geometry chaos. Another graduate student introduced me to this idea of fractals. Back then in the mid 80s, we were just starting to have our own PCs. And there were basic, simple programs that you could get to generate fractals right there on your own screen. You didn't need a mainframe or anything to do it. And so fractals, as many of you know, are these self-similar objects, the way nature really designs things. We modern people, and even going quite a ways back, we like to design objects and shapes and technology and buildings around Euclidean shapes that have a definable metric of measurable space, common metric, and share, some basic shapes and are linear and sort of easy to measure and control. Nature doesn't actually do it that way. If you think about the shape of trees with branching structures that keep branching out, or the shape of your bronchial system, which kind of branches and branches all the way down into small capillaries that infiltrate your entire body. Nature uses fractals to get the most surface area into a finite space. So this is one of them that I generated on my own with one of those computer programs back then in, well, this would have been about 20 years ago now with this particular graphic. And so you can kind of get the idea. It's self-similar. It looks the same at different scales, from the macro scale all the way down to the micro. And if you look around how nature designs things, it's usually around fractal shapes because they're very resilient. You can damage a branch, but it won't affect the whole tree. There's not one, place apart from the main trunk where it can really be taken out because it just has so many branching structures. Of course, trees are like this to get maximum exposure to carbon dioxide and sunlight and so forth. And nature uses these fractals in many different ways. But the thing about fractals is they don't have a clearly defined dimension. So if you think about something like clouds sort of look 3D, but technically they're not three-dimensional objects because the closer you look at a fractal, the more detail you see. Clouds are technically something around 2.3 dimension. More than a two-dimensional surface, but not quite three-dimensional because the closer you look at a cloud, the more droplets you see. It never resolves quite to a solid object. So fractals are objects that are between dimensions. Between dimensions, in any way you can think about that. They're between 1 and 2 dimensions. Many objects that we interact with are between 2 and 3 dimensions, but they never resolve into a line because the closer you look, the more detail you see. And even Scientific American recognized this way back. I think this article is from 1990. In our arterial structure has a fractal structure. Heart has a fractal structure. And there's even fractal structure of time. These are things like your heart that never quite repeat themselves. The heart, a healthy heart, and this is something I learned from this Scientific American article, and you'll see how this all applies in a moment to these other topics. A healthy heart is not one that has a very even beat to it. You want it to fluctuate because our environment's always fluctuating. So nature built us to fluctuate. And in fractal time systems, 1 hour will look like 1 second, will look like 1 year in terms of patterns, the shape of dynamics. They look similar at different scales. So they're not linear as much as self-similar. So this is a whole different class of objects than we are used to being taught about, mainly because fractals are not as easy to study as linear objects. You can't get a defined distance from them. And the perfect example of this from Benoit Mandelbrot, the mathematician who worked for IBM in Armonk, New York, who discovered fractals in line noise in telephone lines. He came up with this coastline of England example. And the question is, what's the length of the coastline of England or the UK? The answer is there is no fixed coastline length. Why? Because it depends on the size of your ruler. And you can kind of see this. If your ruler is a mile long, it's, as you see this, maybe this example on the left, you can't really get into the crevices of the coastline and all the nooks and crannies and the harbors and so forth. But as your ruler gets smaller and smaller, this is kind of the idea of a limit. As it gets smaller, the length increases because now you can measure smaller and smaller spaces. So the answer would be the length of the coastline of England is infinite if your ruler is infinitely small. Do you see why? Because now you're going between sand grains, you're going between molecules and between atoms. You kind of get the idea. This is the idea of a fractal object, is it doesn't have defined distances, defined averages, and so forth. Those concepts are inventions of our own mind, but that is not how nature generally creates reality. You generally don't see these Platonic solids and so forth that the Greeks were fond of. and our culture comes for in large part from Greek civilization. So we inherited this sort of rational linear idea that reality can kind of make sense. But what I'm here tonight to show you is it doesn't make sense, not in that way. It has a different logic. There's also this fractal pattern in music. It's called the 1/f spectrum. Other people have called it flicker noise or pink noise, which is there is some correlation between the notes, but it's not a linear correlation. Obviously, if there's a linear correlation, music would not sound very musical. But there's a lot more variation in the high notes than in the lower notes. And if you just think of any of your favorite songs, where is there more variation? In the treble range versus the bass, which tends to be more repetitive. So we find these fractals even in things like music. And again, it's known as pink noise. White noise would be more random, and brown noise is more correlated. So what makes music interesting is it's not completely random and it's not completely correlated, but it does have a pattern that's called flicker noise. And so fractals are seen in time, and they're seen in patterns of processes around which life is built. So one other influence on me in graduate school, I mean, this is what I learned in grad school, is I was one floor down at WSU in Pullman, Washington, of Grover Krantz. Grover Krantz was the first academic in the US to study Bigfoot and to take it seriously as a real creature, animal, whatever they thought it was back then. They thought it was some relic ape at the time in the 80s. I never met Grover. He was only one floor above me. I had friends who hung out with him. So he was sort of in my orbit, but I never remember talking to him. But this is someone I was around a lot in graduate school, in the vicinity, maybe just 30 feet away, but I actually don't remember having a conversation or attending any of his conferences. But this Bigfoot person was very close to me in sociology. We'll get back to that in a second. My introduction to these subjects we're about to talk about is through remote viewing. When I got done with graduate school, and I was an assistant professor for a while, and then I moved to Boulder, Colorado, and I heard someone talking about remote viewing on my local community radio station, KGNU, the show Tributaries, Robin Claire, and she was interviewing someone named Courtney Brown. You might have heard of Farsight Institute. And he was saying that there was this newly declassified intelligence program that had trained psychic spies. And this is something anyone could learn. And he had some classes, and he had a book called Cosmic Voyage at the time. And I went out and got this book. And I really didn't think it was believable, because it said that anybody could learn to do this, and basically that you and I could pick up information at a distance. Now, keep in mind, I've been in school for 27 years at this point. So there are things that you might, I'm sure there are a lot of things that are true at this point, but I haven't been exposed to them. I've been in graduate school focusing on, getting the degree and so forth. So I went and took the course, and I found that the results really exceeded my expectations in a big way. I mean, within a few days, everybody, and these are sort of what the classes look like since I started teaching them in 97. It's something you do as a group. Those are some examples of classes I taught in Japan over the years, about 20 years ago. And those were pretty large classes. But it's something that you could teach in a group. You could teach it over a few days. And it's something you did with a pencil, a pen, and paper. And I found that I got results after a few days in my training, and other people got results that looked like this. These aren't military trained people that trained for a year with Ingo Swann or anything over in New York City, like some of the military guys and gals did. Even a total beginner like me, who didn't think they had any special natural psychic ability, could do work like this. This is just from someone in my class, I think on the first day. You would give them a target that is hidden in a folder, and all they're given are these random numbers. You can see them on the right side of the page. They're written on top of the folder in a Post-it note. And somehow the viewer, through this subterranean information channel, was able to reproduce the drawing and describe, you can see on the right side, Washington Monument. This person, when you're doing this, you don't know if you're correct or not, because you're not given the feedback, until the end of the session. So you might start doubting yourself. In this case, he thought it was the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, he started on the Washington Monument, but then said it can't be the Washington Monument. It can't work that quickly. So maybe it's the reflecting pool. You know, on the back of the sheet, he drew the Lincoln Memorial, which is exactly opposite the Washington Monument. So you start seeing these very accurate sessions, and it starts changing your view of reality, of what's possible. Because I don't know, if you're like me, like nobody told you that you could do this. Not even remotely told you could do this, no pun intended. I mean, it's not discussed, these sort of psychic phenomena or anything like this. I think maybe like myself, you may have seen those 3 women psychics on some of those TV detective shows, Bevy Yeagers and others, who would work with the police and solve crimes and so forth. So I thought maybe special people could do this, but it turned out everyone can do this to some degree or another. Some people are better at it, but everybody can do it. And it's just kind of shocking. You can even do it double blind. You can pick a number of targets and not know which one is going to be in the folder. And the person can still describe it. So it's not coming from the monitor's mind. It's not like the viewer is tapping into your mind and just reading your mind, because sometimes double blind, viewer doesn't know, a monitor doesn't know what it is either, but it still can be very accurate, as you can see from this reproduction of this little laptop screen, a laptop ad from a number of years ago, very small screen. So our view is, like, for me, like a gateway drug to a larger range of topics, as you're about to see, because I started to wonder, first of all, when I was studying fractals and chaos theory in graduate school, I started to wonder whether there are a range of phenomena that were not being studied by Western science because they didn't fit into the linear methodology of statistics that's become commonplace in social science and other disciplines. In other words, was academia just picking the topics that would more easily fit into their pre-existing worldview, and not things like RV, which are a little more challenging to explain? By the way, I am giving a presentation about this to IRVA in about a week or so, the conference, International Remote Viewing Association, about how RV may work around Hubble effect and something. So like that, if you're interested, you can find out more about that. But this isn't something that easily fits into sort of ordinary Western ideas. So I began wondering, even during graduate school, were we so focused on linear statistical techniques that we were not looking at nonlinear statistical techniques, things that might have been built around fractals that didn't fit that linear mindset. And so it led me to wonder, well, if they didn't tell us about RV, what else didn't they tell us about? Kind of what Lorien was hinting at earlier in our visit to Bigelow Aerospace. It's sort of like I began wondering what else was out there. And I didn't have to wait very long, because some of the people that ended up at these classes at Farsight, where I started teaching, were people that had worked in NASA and the government, who had been exposed to various UFO, UAP evidence. Even a guy that said, who had worked on transcribing NASA 16 millimeter film footage to video. That was his specialty in the 80s, when video was becoming popular, of VCR. He said you could clearly see ruins on the surface of the moon that he said NASA wasn't showing us. He could see it in this footage that had never been shown to the public. So people like that, other people that had worked in the shuttle program, told me about black triangles. So I really started wondering what else was out there. This is a good book about remote viewing. Uri Geller, who did an excellent interview recently with Ross Coulthart about the program, he said there's still things about it today he's not allowed to talk about. It was kind of a bombshell interview, because he mentioned having Werner von Braun come visit him one day and take him to, I forget which airbase it was, where Yuri said they saw frozen bodies, non-human, humanoid bodies. This is just a couple of weeks ago on the News Nation YouTube channel. But Uri Geller was the first test subject at SRI before Ingo Swann and before others. They had him over for 6 weeks. And while he was there, they did experience strange phenomena in and around Lawrence Livermore Lab, where he was viewing and being tested and so forth. So it just sort of suggests that there's other processes going on, non-ordinary EM fields that induce other phenomena. In the interview with Ross, Yuri thought some of the scientists were being influenced by ETs or something and hallucinating. But I think it's more like what we call the hitchhiker effect, is that when you start employing and interacting with these non-EM fields, we'll talk about this in a moment, what these are, it brings in other phenomena that we're just not used to, and you start seeing more of what's there that you didn't see before. Nina Kaligina is also another person like Yuri that could do PK. As you're aware, Yuri, John, he wasn't just an RVer. These topics are connected. People that are good at RV can also do PK, micro PK and PK psychokinesis. Nina Kaligina was one of these people, and you can see videos on YouTube. Her levitating objects in glass boxes surrounded by Soviet scientists, skeptical Soviet scientists. You can see her doing this. And I saw examples of this in Japan, which we have time at the end. I'll show some pictures of that, of someone that could actually bend bottles and spoons and levitate objects and so forth right in front of your eyes. So these are different energy fields, and we'll explore in a moment what sort of types of energies could actually make this possible. An excellent movie, by the way, if you want to learn more about RV, since that's not the main focus tonight, Third Eye Spies by Lance Muggia and Russell Targ, one of the people that ran SRI along with Dr. Hal Puthoff. This is a very good movie about the history of the U.S. RV program and what it was doing and where it came from and so forth. So RV is actually what led me to crop circles, because it was my first time I even ever heard about crop circles. No one in graduate school had told me about crop circles. And it was a target to view. And I wanted to get my feedback. You saw some of the kind of more ordinary targets that viewers view, monuments and mountains and sort of ordinary things that we're familiar with, famous sites and people. But you can view esoteric targets, but you don't get the feedback in the same way you would from Washington Monument, right? So once I viewed this, I wanted to go over to the UK and see what these things were, since we were told we didn't know how they were made and what the purpose was and what was going on here. And I went with a guy named Ron Russell, who was at this Denver UFO conference. I went to my first UFO conference in '96, and there was Ron Russell talking about crop circles. We don't know who makes them, how they're made. The first one I went into was the Koch snowflake fractal. A fractal right there by Silbury Hill in Wiltshire, near the town of Marlborough. And it's the largest and oldest, biggest earth mound in Europe, right there, man-made. And there was this huge football-sized field, Koch snowflake, which, I had studied this for my dissertation. It's a type of deterministic fractal that, I learned how to calculate the dimensions and so forth, and found a way to use it to measure information and so forth. But this was the one that I was familiar with. But in the books I had, in school, it was like this big to save printer's ink. That's how big my Koch snowflake was. That I looked at here, it was the size of a football field. You can see how you iterate, how you keep generating this self-similar pattern. And it creates something called the Hausdorff dimension and so forth, which is how you measure the dimension of fractals. But here it was in my first crop circle. And then kind of variations of it appeared. Anyway, crop circles turned out to be very interesting because we continually found these electromagnetic effects. This particular formation caused Ron's compass just to spin around like a motor. Okay, so very strange. How could something inert like wheat and small? This is not very big. That right in front of Silbury Hill is a small circle, but it caused this magnetism. It didn't happen outside the circle, and this is very easy to study because you go outside the circle with your equipment, and then you go in and you see what happens. So we found these circles had electromagnetic effects. They could also create time slips. In this particular circle near Avebury, Truslow, town of Avebury, has a stone circles. It's the only town in Europe surrounded by a stone circle, Avebury. And Ron said that he went out to get more film, and he noticed that the wheat started to look very tall and the path became very narrow, and he encountered people that seemed like they were from another time in the UK, like maybe 500 years ago. They were speaking a different type of English, and they were shorter and wearing this kind of garb and so forth. And he felt very strange. When he got back, he felt like an hour had gone by. He never made it to the car. Just experiencing this experience he had. But the people back in this circle said he'd only been gone for 5 minutes, maybe 10. But to Ron, it seemed like 45 minutes an hour. So that's sort of an example of a time slip. In fact, it's interesting synchronicity here, Lorien, because Lorien gave this time travel conference, which I think she'll make available at some point again. And she asked me to participate. And I heard many examples of this and started studying it of people who go to a location and experience another time in history at that location that doesn't fit with the current present moment, or go into it temporarily like Ron did and come back. I've even talked to friends I know who've experienced this too, which you can ask me about later. I've talked to many people now, including some RV students in my class, literally crossing the street and seeing it go back to cowboy days and then coming back again. That's a very interesting aspect of this. In our own circles that we made, we also got these strange distortions. I mean, this is one we had permission to make, a small one in Hays, Kansas, coming back from the Austin Remote Viewing Conference in 2002. And all of the pictures, and this is a professional Nikon camera, all of the pictures came out blurry, strange lights. Nobody knows what this is, but the camera never did it before and it never did it again. It wasn't like light leakage. It was something to do with the circle. It could be static charges and so forth. We'll get into that in a moment. And by the way, this is a very interesting book that the original idea of crop circles is that they were made by plasma vortices. And this is Terence Meaden's book, The Circles Effect and Its Mysteries. This is very interesting that people had different ideas of what caused them. There's an excellent book. I don't have it in front of me now. It's called The Secret History of Crop Circles by Terry Wilson. And Wilson went back 100 years to circles from the 20s, from the 30s, 40s. And you have reports of whirlwinds, tornadoes, plasma vortices, things creating them, UFOs, the Tully saucer nests. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment in Australia. There are different things that create crop circles. That's what I'm trying to say. And even the plasma vortex theory, Meaden said it was very rare. It's not like most of them were made that way, maybe just a few every year. I'll show you in a moment an example of one that I saw that looked made that way. But we found, even talking to the human circle makers, as a lot of these people started making them, Doug and Dave, late 80s. Doug had seen the Tully saucer nest. Human circle makers described, and I had an interview with Matt Williams. It's on my blog, newcrystalmine.com, on the Matt Williams YouTube channel, Secret Vault. And he said he talked about it again in the interview about 2 weeks ago. They saw orbs coming towards them as they were about to start making one in the Tosmead Copse area, and they ran away. They didn't want to mess with these orbs. They came right. They thought they were like headlamps or farmers' lamps, but they came over the tops of the fields and converged on where they had been. And they got out of there. So even the human circle makers experienced strange phenomena out there. Shadow people, small UFOs. One circle maker, one of the best of them, you've seen his circles over the years, told me small black triangles. They would see them over their formations like they were inspecting them for real. So orbs show up around crop circles. This was from a German tourist coming to visit us. We were at Woodborough Hill, right there in those trees. And he saw this over a crop circle and took the picture. It's really there. It's ball lightning, in my view. I think at the time I would have thought it was a small UFO or something, but this is what ball lightning is, and we'll talk about that in a sec. So I saw this myself in my own experiences at this circle called the Devil's Den Formation. 5 field down. Let's see if we can play the audio. I mean, I saw 3 devices get affected by this.
My GPS has just gone wrong, basically, and the screen has gone.
Look at this, the strange sort of pixelation. Let me get a close
like it's been pushed or something. That's solid plastic. The last time I had this, all my batteries got red hot.
Well, this was someone saying,
batteries.
I've seen it many times, we had 14 hours of battery life, new batteries when we
flat as a
came in,
pancake.
and now they're hot and they're completely
Have a look.
and within seconds. So my
That's
static
only
meter
10 times I've
stopped
had in the
working.
life.
Correct
You had 14 hours when you came in.
meter, we were
14
attempting
hours of
to
battery life when I
reproduce some
came
of
in. It's great.
BLT measurements with static. The BLT team, Burke, Levengood, and Talbot, who studied these at the time, and they had detected some static changes. So we wanted to see we did find some static changes. My static meter rose up. Masao Maki, a sushi restaurant owner in Boulder, who I hadn't met before, coming from Boulder. He wasn't very far from my office where we did the RV teaching, but I met him over in the UK, but his camcorder got dirty heads indicator, new Sony camcorder. That doesn't happen for 10 years if you've owned one. And then Rob Spate comes in and battery. So 3 devices in about 5 minutes. So I mean, it's right there at the edge. It creates a very strong electrostatic charge, which leads charge separation and a host of other effects. And we'll show that in a second. But it was very interesting to me just looking at this presentation recently from the International Conference on Anomalies in Hydrogen-Loaded Metals. Kind of long name, but another name for LENR, low energy reaction. They found, look at the ratios of these circles. It just seems, you start looking and wondering, is it to do with the ratios of the circles, the repetitiveness of the pattern of the swirls? It's just interesting that it often matches up with other people working other subject matters, in this case, LENR, in terms of the mathematical ratios, creating these special effects that those researchers are looking for. In other words, to generate excess heat in a closed loop. I talked to different camera crews, and this camera crew from National Geographic, they only, at the end of this long interview, they only showed my hand holding the static meter at the end of the show. After talking, it was great. We talked about the formations, and they finally showed my hand. Oh, geez. You got to watch out for these professional camera crews. But I got a great story out of it. They said they had talked to the BBC camera crew right down there at Silbury Hill a number of years before, I think around 1990 or something. They said that this professional camera of the BBC crew malfunctioned so badly in the crop circle, they had to reboot it. It was a software-driven beta cam, and they had to reboot it to get it to work. So it was just more examples of professional camera crews also having their cameras go on the fritz. This was one of our tour participants, and let's see if I can, I've got she was saying that it affected her.
Okay.
Oh, here.
So, Pam, what happened to your cameras in the circle?
Well, you know how when you take a picture with a digital camera, and the picture you've taken shows up in the view screen, and then it goes away, and it shows you what you're looking at so that you can take more pictures. Well, mine doesn't do that when I'm in a crop circle. It shows me the picture I've taken, and then it shuts down.
Camera shuts down.
And what formations, where did that happen?
I first became really aware of it in the Chutes formation.
It's on the upper left.
And then it happened again in the Avebury.
And so the viewfinder, instead of showing you the preview what you just took, it just shuts down.
Instead of showing you what you took and what you can take again, it just shuts down. Mm-hmm. Just the viewfinder, not the entire camera.
So this is kind of...
It doesn't do that anywhere else.
Amazing. Okay.
This is kind of typical as one aspect of the functionality. The device will stop working. Like it's encountering a field of energy that doesn't play well with the electronics. It can be severe enough to destroy cameras. I've seen it melt solder joints in cameras just being on top of the wheat, not filming or anything, just sitting there. It happened to a camcorder in '97. So they crop circles are just known to do this. And our big discovery was even some of the ones that we later learned were man-made were doing this too. So it wasn't from some residue of UFO propulsion system or even a residue of a plasma vortex coming down. The shape itself, the spiraling and the directionality, the chirality, it's called in material science. The spin, the physical direction of the rotation of the wheat stalks seemed, if it was done sort of in a precise way, to have these anomalous energetic effects. By the way, one other thing that Pam saw, which you can see in the lower left here, she saw a tiny little blue ball lightning in Avery. She was sitting in the grass. I was over by one of the stones. You can kind of lie with your back to these, 5,000-year-old stones. And they're really huge. And she said she just saw this a couple feet in front of her. She thought it was sun reflecting on a water droplet, but when she even covered her hands over it, it still glowed. And she was able to take a picture of it. So just before we talk about ball lightning in a few moments, it can show up anywhere, and it's small sizes, microscopic sizes, in fact, but it's visible to the human eye. Here's an example of an orb I saw over West Overton. And I mean, this is just hanging below a cloud. My camera's moving around. This is the quality of cameras 25 years ago, but before they were internally stabilized. This is just a Sony camcorder, digital film, and this was below a cloud. But look at it's just gone, isn't it? Oh, there it is again, and then it's gone. So it's just hanging below a cloud doing this. It's, in my view, right, it's a type of ball lightning. Flickering like that, different colors and everything. So it's just fascinating. You can just be around and see these things. Here's someone's magnetic compass in their watch being affected by being in a crop circle. Often the photos in the circle would come out blurry. I think this is blurry because I'm just a little too close, but there are times when the focusing mechanism would stop on a camera. So all this, yeah, look at these weird patterns showing up in someone's viewfinder. It looks almost like a constellation. Isn't that pretty intense for a random pattern to show up in your viewfinder after being in a crop circle? So, one of the things we looked at, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, was, there are structures that nature makes of metamaterials, which are finely tuned man-made surfaces that are smaller than the wavelength of a particular electromagnetic frequency that can act like waveguides. And nature does this, with the Morphos butterfly, whose wings are blue, but they're not blue from dye, they're blue from a photonic waveguide effect. And insects use it to repel water, as you can see on the right. And then it can provide very strong shells for different types of, shelled creatures and so forth. So there are different ways to manufacture small-scale surfaces, and you kind of wonder if the crop circles are doing that too, since it's very repetitive, like these photonic structures, but just at a slightly larger scale. So one idea that I would have had back then, and this might be still why it works, is this woodpile effect where you have these very repetitive patterns can turn any structure, even something inert like wheat, into a waveguide. So, and again, feel free to ask me any questions at the end of this, whatever you think about this. Tully saucer nest. Well, this is what they look like. In Australia, these were reed circles made in marshes where flying discs, UFOs, now called UAPs, we're seen. Even Doug Bauer, who later became, Doug and Dave, the two guys from the pub, was inspired to recreate these in the UK, he said. Interesting thing about the Doug and Dave interview with I think it was with BBC. The last sentence they said in the interview is, we always felt like something was making us do it. They're not the only circle makers to say that. In my interview with Matt Williams 2 weeks ago, he was asking me, I reminded him of this story where he felt compelled to go out and make one night, and he was just going to sleep and he saw this pattern, drove down a ways to make one. The pattern he felt he had to make was the exact shape that a group was meditating upon just 100 yards from that area, not far near the Ridgeway near Avebury. It's ancient road, even predates the Roman times, the Ridgeway. It's actually called the oldest road in the world. It was there when Europe was connected to the UK. Before the English Channel existed, there was this Ridgeway road for, Iron Age people. And Matt was there. He made a flower of life, and there was a group nearby meditating, but he didn't know about it. And he said he heard guitars and flutes coming from that area, but they weren't playing any instruments. So you wonder what was going on out there. So anyway, there can be different influences that get people to do this. But this is the Tully saucer nest, what inspired people to do this. Now, one of the interviews for that I interviewed for my book, Black Swan Ghosts. And this is available in the videos on the blackswanghost.com channel. You can just watch Louise Voves and about 7 or 8 other witnesses. She said she saw a UFO flat in a meadow picking huckleberries in Usk, Washington. Coming over from Idaho, her brother was a huckleberry baker. They made products, and there was a disc kind of hovering over the area. And a woman and her son went to call the sheriff. And she said, just as it was leaving, it dove down, made a whistling sound. You can watch the video and hear her describe it. But she said it flattened the meadow. I said, Louise, how flat? She said flat as a pancake. So that's 90 degrees. So that sounds a lot like a UFO affecting plants, which is very similar to what witnesses have said. And you can see this in the secret history of crop circles. So here's another witness. In case you're one of these people that goes the other side of me and says, no, they're all man-made. No, there are witnesses who've seen things like that form from UFOs. So there are all types. Here's an example of Colin Andrews, crop circle researcher, now lives in Connecticut, originally from the UK. Here he is, one of our tour guests on one of our crop circle tours. His camera stops working, and a Japanese tourist photographed this helical structure in the center of a crop circle. That just looks like the pollen is being shaped by some energy field right into a spiral vortex. To my eyes, that's what it looks like. And then Colin and a French engineer, Jean-Noel Aubrun, did a magnetometer experiment over the Milton Hill Farms formation of 2000, which I got to visit with Ron Russell. We didn't know where it was, but we walked for a couple hours to find it in this little farming town. But look how closely this superposition is between the magnetic flux and the circles. Now, this was man-made because I later found all 5 people who were involved in making it. And they did not bury any magnets there. But the magnetic field strength in, I think it's microteslas, was pretty strong. We're getting up 24, 25 range, which is, Aubrun and Andrews concluded that this had to be very strong magnets buried beneath these circles, but there weren't any magnets buried there. So again, assuming the results are right, you're having an inert structure like wheat create huge magnetic fields. The wheat is swirled into a vortex. And these little orbs show up around these circles. Here's one from Barbary Castle that a tourist photographed. And it's just over the area. Then it takes off at about like 200 miles an hour or something. I mean, kind of measured how far it went. Zips off. Now here's an example of a circle that to me doesn't look man-made. This one looks like it's made from some force of wind, plasma vortex or something. Okay, so there are the other type too. And this was from 2010, the Westbury Whitehorse area. If you look at this, and there's even some grape shot going off to the side of it, it looks like something an energy field kind of came down and pushed right down on the radial lay. It's kind of all coming out from the center. Now, later on, I started thinking there could be other energy fields that we can't see. And I created a little manuscript about this, about possibly dark energy, dark matter actually interacting with the electromagnetism of the crop formation in some way. In this particular article, I focused on dark energy since it's the most prevalent type of energy in the universe. This unknown force, even Einstein talked about it, called it the cosmological constant. He later dismissed it, as later said, that was my biggest mistake because it was found to exist. It pushes galaxies apart and creates this apparently expanding universe. And since it's so prevalent, I thought maybe that it's interacting with the spiral patterns in some way. Maybe it's like just going through everything else, but something about the spiral shape. Not a bad idea. I can't prove this, but it would be one idea of why circles may become electromagnetically active. This is a good book, talks about lots of cases, strange cases around circles, ball lightning, orbs, people's experience with that. Now, more recently, in our discussion about OSAP ATIP, you had this book from Lakatsky, Keller, and Knapp, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. You're familiar with this book. And they mentioned cryptids and orbs and energy anomalies and the hitchhiker effect. And it seemed to me a lot similar in some ways to what we had seen around crop circles in terms of the camera and battery failure, which, you can see on the show Secret of Skinwalker Ranch, which I think is now in a new season. I've seen some of the show. So you have these areas where you also get these anomalies, but you also get strange creatures that we call cryptids, right? In the case of Skinwalker Ranch, you had these huge wolf-like creatures, which we call dogmen, Bigfoot, kind of predator-like shimmering creatures, which you couldn't see, but you could see sort of the outline of them. So this is very interesting that you had someone from Defense Intelligence Agency who specializes in plasma physics and directed energy weapons writes a book about Skinwalker Ranch. And then you had this original book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, which goes into similar effects. Now, interestingly enough, Lakatsky and Keller were asked just last week on a podcast if they would testify at this upcoming hearing on November 13th as of the recording of this talk right now. In front of, I think, Joint House Senate Intelligence Committee or something, and they said no, they wouldn't do it. They signed NDAs, and they can't talk about it. So, I mean, you can kind of see what the issue is here, folks. Anybody that gets involved with this up front gets exposed to topics that they can't talk about again. You heard Lou Elizondo talk about this not too long ago, and others. They can't talk specifically about what they know about UFOs, UFO crash materials, retrievals, NHI, non-human intelligence. They can write general books. These have to be vetted, obviously, by DIA, since they were funded by them. But still, there's a huge amount that these people know that even now, years later, they said their NDA prevents them from talking about what really happened at Skinwalker Ranch and the UFO program. So this is just the surface level. Seriously. This is an excellent report. Strange effects from UFOs from NICAP, Donald Kehoe, from, I believe, the late 60s, and Gordon Lohr, where they go into many strange cases of UFOs, orbs, ball lightning, and so forth, strange space-time effects and so forth. You can once you start looking into these topics, you see that there's this sort of general range of phenomena that we see over and over again, extending to cryptids and Bigfoot, which are these sudden changes in temperature, often a sudden cold coming over the area, a strange sort of silence where everything becomes quiet around you. Same from Bigfoot to UFOs to other phenomena, ghosts and haunted sites. Then again, these sorts of things, this sense of time slips, kind of time loss, it just makes you think that there's some underlying patterns here. Stan Gordon, who's an excellent researcher, has written about this in one of his books, the older book from about 12 years ago, Silent Invasion. Now, Stan started out, for those of you who are researchers in this subject or just curious, he started out in 1959 as the phone boy for the Westinghouse Informal Afterwork Group in Pittsburgh, of which Stanton Friedman was a member. And they needed someone to take calls from the public. So that was Stan's job at age 10. He was their phone kid. And he's been answering the phone ever since 1959. I don't know. Most of you were not alive in 1959. I'm just guessing right now. So Stan Gordon's been doing this that long. And he found that starting in the 60s, even before Patterson-Gimlin film, Bigfoot started showing up around the UFOs at the same time. I know to some UFO researchers, this is kind of heretical because they don't want Bigfoot mixed in with their UFOs, and the Bigfoot researchers don't want anything else. They want it to be their relic primate. They don't want UFOs mixed in with their Bigfoot tracks, but they do mix. And if you read Stan's book, his newer books are called Creepy Cryptids, and we talk sometimes and stay in contact. He shares all these types of cases. I mean, this is just one example of someone seeing a UFO in the area And then the next thing they know, they see creatures in the same field. So what's the connection there? Is it like a parallel reality that they're both coming from? Just really good question. I don't know if it has anything to do with it, the creature, but every time we see that or hear that, the light is pretty close. Again, a connection between orbs or UFOs, intelligently, piloted craft with these creatures. Again, to me, suggests a completely different type of EM field that we're not used to. If you go to Stan's website, Stan Gordon Anomaly Zone, he updates it all the time. This is just one example of a white-haired Bigfoot being seen next to this sort of almost 1897-ish airship type UFO with the beam coming down. The most recent case was cars stalling. This is Western Pennsylvania, where he gets most of his calls from. Cars stalling when an object came over, a tube-like object came over the highway, and a number of cars' engines just stalled out. And he also shares other stories of thunderbirds, pterodactyls, huge winged creatures, and things we'll see over there, including ornithologists and others. So people do not share these stories. And one thing I had to say, as a sociologist, we call this hidden events. We're familiar with this. These are things that people are experiencing, but for some reason they're not talking about for fear of ridicule, ostracism, retribution from their bosses. This is why we don't hear more about these phenomena, because people are afraid of, the type of loss of social status from their friends, family, neighbors, being seen as weird. I mean, people like you and me, we don't care anymore, but a lot of people do, and they won't talk about these encounters. They will share it with you at conferences, which is why I go to as many as I can. They will talk to you. Terry Lovelace, Terry, he shared this stories in his book. In the second book, Devil's Den: The Reckoning, he had a lot of readers he selected the best stories that people had sent to him, filled with stories of orbs and time loss and very strange phenomena. Again, this kind of crosses over the boundary from UFOs to cryptids to RV experiences and so forth. So what are some of the cosmological factors? Well, Alexander Parkhomov, whose book was translated by Bob Greenyer at Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project, Space, Earth, Human. This is an excellent book showing us about the effect of cosmological particles coming from cosmic background radiation from the beginning of our universe. In this case, ultra low energy neutrinos, so-called relic neutrinos, that have a scale that interact with us from microns to millimeters. These are large, slow particles that don't interact with us electromagnetically, but interact with us gravitationally. They're a component of dark matter. According to Parkhomov and Greenyer, maybe 1 or 2% of dark matter are these relic neutrinos. Parkhomov set up this, and I'm just showing you this because you can start measuring this if you use your ingenuity. Parkhomov created his own relic neutrino detector with ex-Soviet equipment when the Soviet Union was breaking up in the early 90s. And he was able to measure these variations in biological and chemical reactions based on time of year, even radioactive beta decay. This should not happen according to science as we understand it. There should not be a seasonal effect of fruit fly growth or biological reactions or radioactive decay. But Parkhomov, by the way, who was one of the directors of the Soviet remote viewing program, which is why the US had one, because the Soviets got there first in the 60s, and Parkhomov was one of the people that created it. In his book, Space, Earth, Human, he has a chapter on remote viewing, people that could do PK and stuff like this. But he went from, interestingly enough, from, classified avionics research into remote viewing and then into relic neutrino research. And this is sort of this seasonal variation year after year after year in all these different types of radioactive decay, which conventional science would say there shouldn't be any cosmological factors. But what it shows is that as the Earth and the Milky Way kind of move through the universe, there are these different seasonal factors. We're exposed to more or less of these relic neutrinos, which as a type of dark matter cluster around gravitational objects. And you and I are interacting with them now. You get more outside than you would inside because they're blocked by objects and so forth. But it's just interesting that there's a cosmological factor to this. Because even in remote viewing, we knew about sidereal time, kind of time of day of the Earth relative to the center of the Milky Way, affecting RV accuracy. So dark matter starts coming into this type of matter that outnumbers ordinary matter. You read different estimates, maybe 4 to 5 to 1 or more. A type of matter, Fritz Zwicky discovered this in the 1920s, looking at a particular galaxy formation, and there wasn't enough matter there to explain how it could hold together. So the idea is there's this mystery matter, and it kind of clumps together, as you can see. This is a model of it, again, in this sort of fractal web-like way, not in this linear way that we're used to understanding. And so one other aspect of this, the PK aspect, just to mention it really briefly, is that Pear Labs at Princeton studied this, which is your ability to affect a micro random number generator, a machine that spits out ones and zeros 10,000 times a second. And as you can see from the graph, after 20 years and 375,000 trials, that it moves towards 1 if you're thinking 1 and more towards 0 if you're thinking 0, which is interesting. The green line would be the random line in the middle. So all of us have this effect on our surroundings and other people, which means you need to be aware of how you're affecting things, because this shows you're affecting machines. This was McDonnell Douglas's idea, because they wanted to find out if pilots got upset, would it affect electronics? And maybe not big enough to make them go on the fritz, but we do have an effect. Is this similar to relic neutrinos, like an unseen type of dark matter that we're emitting from our palms or our bodies? It's interesting to think that you and I are emitting energy. Machines pick it up. Parkhomov's relic neutrino detector picks these things up. Again, going back to PK, Nina Kalikina, Uri Geller, and so forth. Is it an actual type of energy that's being emitted? When it's emitted from your hands, it's not called relic neutrinos anymore because it's being created now. It's called cold neutrinos. Cold because they're relatively lower in temperature to fast neutrinos. And this leads to the idea that Boyd Bushman suggested, that there's a neutrino universe that interacts with dark matter and dark energy. So this is one of the big take-home messages of my lecture tonight, is this science going back decades that we haven't had much discussion about in the West says that beyond ordinary Maxwellian electromagnetic fields, there's other fields that interact with neutrinos and dark matter and even dark energy here, which can create anomalous EM effects and interactions with other aspects of our universe that you don't ordinarily see in the normal, ordinary EM fields of Maxwellian electrons. And so various people have suggested this. So in the universe, we started to see that the universe itself has a fractal distribution. In the beginning of the lecture, I said, we can see it at microscales in trees, biology, but someone like Winston Bostick, who was a researcher hired by DOE to find peaceful uses of nuclear power after World War II of the H-bomb, Project Sherwood, found that universes could have a spiral sort of shape, and you can create them in test tubes also. So they exist at this large scale, and they exist in this, as the New York Times called it in 1950 something, physicist creates a universe in a test tube. Again, another type of shape that could interact with dark matter, relic neutrinos, just being created in the lab. This type of research went deep black because the Air Force research on ball lightning references this research, but it's redacted. And it's referring to the research around this era that the Air Force looked into. So this is where it starts to go black for us in terms of information, starting with Winston Bostick and that sort of DOE research, peaceful uses of fusion, power, it seemed like it got in contact with a weird side of the universe that led it to be classified just like UFOs are classified. We're told UFOs are classified. I mean, Lorien was telling you about our visit to Bigelow Aerospace. I'll mention this in a moment, but those people don't talk about it. So I'm just suggesting to you that a chunk of this got cut off from public discussion. It starts here in the 50s with Bostick. Then we had Ken Shoulders, someone formerly worked for NSA in microelectronic masking techniques, and is asked to look into the research of John Hutchinson, the Canadian researcher who attempted to reproduce Tesla's experiments and was able to reproduce some of it at a smaller scale with his own devices, which he was able to reclaim from, I think, surplus military equipment and so forth. And Shoulders found that the Hutchinson fractured metal samples fractured at room temperature just from electromagnetic energy were real and were the product of these charge clusters, which he originally called electron palladium and later called exotic vacuum objects. And this is something you can hear much more in the Martin Fleischmann Memorial Project YouTube channel and so forth. But he found these chains of charge clusters that had these fractal patterns. So the fractals aren't just at the scale of the universe or in our bronchial structure. They're at this invisible layer of electromagnet, forming very quickly and disappearing and forming the basis of orbs and ball lightning. And Shoulders discovered this and claimed that EVOs, exotic vacuum objects, as compared to sort of normal vacuum objects, normal baryonic matter that we're used to around us, another type of energy and matter that exists. This is really something. It exists in the same space we're in, but it doesn't couple into our reality because it's operating so much faster. It's phasing in, phasing out. It has a black, dark state too. Now, just yesterday, I'm reading Science magazine, and lo and behold, they discovered a fractal type of electricity. I don't know if anyone ever told them about Ken Shoulders, but folks, this has been discovered before. And the big amazing thing about these electronic static discharge systems, they call it ESD, is it created this IV-like pattern of charge distribution at a rate of 10 million meters a second. Is that fast? That's what Ken Shoulders was talking about. It's really fast, and it comes into existence and disappears. It could be happening around you because it's charge neutral. A lot of the time, you don't often see it. But this could be the types of charges that were affecting us in crop circles. So the fractal shape of crop circles could have led to fractal static discharge, fractal charge clusters, and this could be what's affecting our cameras and batteries and so forth. Maybe because this whole article is about how our entire modern industrial and military systems are built on the stability of electronics, and these rapid electric discharges, super fast fractal shapes, branching like this, can destroy electronics really quickly. So we're starting to make some progress here. It's a little bit like rediscovering what other researchers have already looked at, but there you go. So this is just from July 2024, fractal charge clusters. Hello, super fast. And in this recent discussion from Bob Grenier on MFMP site, he talked about the rotation of ball lightning objects in plasma. Same thing, 100,000 kilometers a second. These super fast charges. Shoulders believed that these exotic vacuum objects would cluster together and form micro ball lightning, which is the basis of cold fusion, low energy reaction, and a lot of other phenomena. It starts out as a plasma, but the next stage after a plasma is a condensed plasmoid, plasma with a curve, with a shape, and it condenses and condenses down. And Shoulders, this is why it matters. Shoulders said that this type of darker and darker EVO state, as it became invisible, would form its own sort of black universe in a lower pressure region of space, but right next to us, but you wouldn't see it. Almost sounds paranormal, doesn't it? He said it might even be appropriate to signify that the black universe identified here is the much touted dark matter regime, which is said to dominate in quantum normal matter. So here's, a top level government researcher scientist who's saying that these EVOs form their own type of dark matter, and they have a different charge, and they can have a dark black state where they could be around you, could be embedded in materials around you, and they're just like waiting there. It sounds paranormal. This was my motivation for the title of Dark Matter Monsters, by the way, about cryptids, which we'll get to in a second. And so the fascinating thing is it creates a different permittivity as the charge cluster forms. And as we know, permittivity and permeability are the basis of the speed of light in our universe. That's how you derive the speed of light, the speed of electromagnetic transfer, discovered by Wilhelm Weber 150 years ago. And then Maxwell, they get these estimates of speed of light just from electromagnetic speed in materials that get pretty close to what the speed of light would be, since light is an electromagnetic wave. And, but Shoulders goes on here. I mean, this guy has such a wide-ranging mind. It's so fertile here. Look what he says. You get pseudo-particle entanglement, black EVs, these kind of invisible, think Skinwalker Ranch, these invisible plasmas, charge clusters, and even complex organisms composed entirely of EV structures that are formed at electronic rates, thinks that 10 million meters a second, electronic rates without mechanical or chemical methods. So there could be life forms around us that are based on this other type of charge cluster instead of matter like we're made of, that could coexist in this space. We might not even see them because their permittivity, greatly reduced levels of permittivity is the ability of a material to resist an external magnetic field. But these have lower permittivity, and they can interact a little more freely as the permittivity goes down. He even says it's like what cold fusion is. So we can see how these phenomena are related. And I mean, just going through skinwalkers at the Pentagon, they encounter this dark oval shape. Remember this? The three of the DIA analysts are walking out there. You guys read the book. And they encountered this dark shape that emanated fear and so forth. Well, I asked Jay Stratton, former head of UAP Task Force, and he lectured last year at Vernal at Phenomicon. But the previous year, I just went up to him and asked him about this particular paragraph. And he goes, we don't know what that was. It could have been black ball lightning, or maybe that's just what it looked like. So how your brain perceived it. But again, Shoulders says, and this sounds so similar to what these folks are saying in Skinwalkers. These different coupled states, and it creates a type of superconductivity. But the dark version of the EV doesn't couple into our reality in the same way. This kind of dark blob over the path. It just reminds me of this. So that we could have in the same space we're in other types of matter or even life forms that have a different permittivity, made of charge clusters. They could act lifelike, like they are life forms themselves, but they're made of a different type of matter than we are. And this is an example from the Shakparonov generator, where you can see this here. It's right there for you to see, black ball lightning. Shakparonov generator, by the way, is generated from this Mobius strip shape. And they're able to generate. You've heard you can't create ball lightning in the lab. Wrong. Here it is. You have the luminous type and you have the dark type, which is like a little mini black hole because it's absorbing everything around it. And here's Hutchinson. This is creating some of these effects in the lab, imitating the work of Tesla and so forth, the Hutchinson metal fractures and so forth. So another excellent researcher who unfortunately passed away earlier this year, Dr. Takaaki Matsumoto, he completely reinforces, working independently from Ken Shoulders, comes up with very similar ideas, is that there's a type of ball lightning, micro ball lightning charge clusters. He called it an itonic cluster. Unfortunately, the MFMP are coming out with a newer version of his book with even better photographs, since Bob was able to go over there and get the original photographs of very strange structures that Matsumoto, I think, correctly described as miniature black holes. These aren't the type that are going to swallow up the Earth. They have their own little non-radiating boundary right there. They're microscopic. But that once matter becomes, clustered together from interaction with micro ball lightning, the matter begins to transform, and Matsumoto called it electronuclear regeneration, electronuclear collapse, and then regeneration. In other words, there's this nucleonic alchemy going on where the material literally collapses from these electromagnetic fields that are really strong at a micro level, or miniature black holes, and even the ability of materials to come out of other materials when the original material isn't there. In this case, carbon films coming out of a pure lead ball. It's a type of nucleonic alchemy that we were told doesn't exist, but it does. Alchemy turns out to be real. And Matsumoto, again, understood the fractal connection here because he said just as hydrogen clusters contain a lot of hydrogens and kind of form these itonic clusters, they create their own tiny black holes, which means that what we were called cold fusion, low energy nuclear reaction, is actually a small scale simulation of what stars are doing in the universe. So you have this kind of beautiful connection from the macro to the micro of a similar principle. We're talking about material that gets so close together. You and I were taught that like charges repel. That's what electrons repel. That's at large distances, but at very small scales as they get closer. Even Wilhelm Weber predicted this back in 1837 using Newtonian physics, that you would get negative states of matter. He anticipated superconductivity, Wilhelm Weber, 150 years ago. But that's what Matsumoto is saying here, is the electromagnetic forces overcome any repulsion from like charges and create an attractive effect, which creates a type of nucleonic collapse, breakdown of nuclear structures. And the strength of it is so strong that the particles become detached from the Dirac sea, from the quantum vacuum, and become like this primordial matter, which is quite incredible. And this is what the MFMP have discovered. So again, what Matsumoto is saying here, and what this is linking back is to think about all these phenomena we're talking about tonight. You have this electromagnetic force that's 40 times stronger than the gravitational force, creating tiny black holes, other states of matter, purely electronic forms of life, and so forth. Just think about the implications here. So again, this is an example of carbon spray coming out of lead balls. Pure lead balls are not supposed to emit carbon unless there's some sort of nucleonic transformation going on. Nucleonic synthesis inside these highly compressed objects. There's other ways to do this, by the way. You can do it with sound and cavitation. Mark Leclerc gave a very interesting presentation. I was fortunate to see it a number of years ago at the Breakthrough Energy Movement conference in Boulder, Colorado, where he talked about using this cavitation process to synthesize new elements. It's especially easy to do it with the lighter elements. And as you go down towards lead, it sort of stops there. But this sort of cavitation, which is kind of a microscopic bubble collapse that sound generates, waves, and then the bubbles collapse really quickly and create this kind of nucleonic attraction from the power of the collapse of the bubble, can also create this type of process. It's another way to do cold fusion. And it leads to what we call coherent sound. And we'll get into that in a moment, and why that matters. But we're talking about different types of matter here that has a coherency that we don't normally see in ordinary matter. By the way, this isn't very safe to do this at a very large scale because both Leclerc and his partner, unfortunately, I'm told after this lecture I saw in 2015 or so, got cancer from being around these reactors. So we want to shield these, and you don't want to push them too hard because they create a type of strange radiation, which is still not completely understood. But I mean, again, Lukatsky talked about this in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. Remember these cases of orbs coming into people in their cars, passing through them, and these people later get immune system problems and so forth, types of cancer and so forth. So these types of processes need to be treated with a lot of caution. You should not be chasing any old orb you see out there. because they all have different effects. They have different colors and they have different energy effects. So even in these sort of exotic vacuum-like objects, you see things that look a lot like crop circles. This is from the Michael Solent patent from 1992, a Russian researcher that was patenting these exotic vacuum object type processes. This is an expired patent. You get these patterns at the micro scale. And Bob Greenyer was able to intuit that you get a fractal pattern, going back to what we're saying about fractals. This type of fractal object, the model of these EVOs. Again, when you look at this, I'm showing to you because it's not a completely solid object, because the rings are made of more rings, which are made of even smaller rings. You kind of get the idea. It never really resolves to a solid object. It's just the same shape repeats all the way down to quantum vacuum field. And that's why it's called a phantom toroid, because it's not really there in the same way. It's not completely three-dimensional. It'll be somewhere between 2 and 3. And this is the basis of ball lightning. And ball lightning is something that's been around for hundreds of years. People have reported it coming down chimneys. Different ideas why ball lightning likes chimneys. It's a free-floating fireball, and it can appear in thunderstorms, but it doesn't have to. I've talked to enough witnesses who've seen it. I talked to a witness that saw it. They were hiking in Wyoming in the Wind River Range on Outward Bound, and they were going up this hillside, and they said one of these little ball lightnings was walking down the path towards them, and it just didn't stop, and it went right and then blew up. These can explode at the end of their lifetime, and it threw everyone on the ground. Ball lightning has the power, something like the order of 10 hand grenades worth of energy in the same size of a grapefruit-sized object. It's a really huge amount of quantum energy packed together in there because of the way it forms. And when it comes apart, it can blow out with a very large force. Not necessarily. Sometimes it just disappears and it doesn't do anything. But there's other people I've corresponded with who I included in Dark Matter Monsters who talked about being blown over by ball lightning and so forth. And this is an excellent book. Vladimir Bychkov is an excellent Russian researcher. He had an example, and this is full of these strange cases. This was one of the cases that just blew me away just a few days ago, is that tornadoes can form the same types of condensed matter plasmoids that could create a hole in a window, but there was no ball lightning seen. The tornado created a perfectly round hole, smooth. It smoothed out the glass. How a tornado, it's not this particular tornado, but this was a case from Russia, as many Bychkov cases are from. But there's other researchers who've written about this, Stanley Singer, and there's a lot of Air Force research, Eric Davis, Mark Stenhoff, and I'll show you some other examples of people who've researched this. There's many cases that you can read about. You can look online of these databases of people submitting their ball lightning stories. I've showed you the example I saw over UK of something hanging below a cloud, but often it's moving around. It comes right towards you. It can do the strangest things. It can lift tiles off a roof, but not destroy the rest of the roof. And there's a lot of feeling that tornadoes themselves are not ordinary objects either. They're not explainable by ordinary hydrodynamics or thermodynamics, that they are actually like neutrino dark matter pumps too from the vortex action. And just an example of this from this book by Charles Chandler, which you can download from his site online, The Electromagnetic Nature of Tornadic Supercells. He even argues, and he's sort of not really way out there in terms of looking at dark matter or any of these energies, but he even argues that you need an electromagnetic explanation for tornadoes, or you wouldn't really explain why a volcano would produce tornadoes far away like this, unless there's some sort of electromagnetic effect going on. Because there's a lot of strange things about tornadoes, if you've spoken to people who've been in them, where it's not a uniform pattern to destruction. There's areas within the funnel where nothing's happening, and then another area where it is more like a fractal distribution of energy. And many other strange electromagnetic effects of tornadoes, their ability to seemingly create sort of an anti-gravity effect. I mean, forces way exceeding any ordinary thermodynamics, picking up very heavy objects and even making them seem like they're dust-defying in some ways. Very strange, but it links tornadoes because of the vortex action as a self-organizing energetic structure back to all these other topics. And the person that really sort of recently explained it was David Freiberger from Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. Ball lightning research funded by Department of Energy, which is that it's a type of condensed magnetic energy that he calls a vorton, another type of EM effect that hasn't really been discovered yet by science because it would involved with very heavy particles. But again, even from Freiberger, this would be the fundamental model of all of these phenomena we've been talking about tonight, is a vortex, compacted vortex type structure at a microscopic scale of very heavy particles that condenses energy, condenses matter down, causes ionization, the photoelectric effect, is the basis of ball lightning, but not just ball lightning that people see walking down a path or coming out of a cloud. And we're talking about earth lights, mobile luminous objects, all of these different types of objects, Freiberger says, are coming from what he calls this photon-like structure. I mean, you don't have to use his terminology, but it's the same sort of process he's talking about. Is a highly condensed EM field that interacts with other types of energy and matter that normal matter doesn't. Even John Archibald Wheeler from Princeton, who was the thesis supervisor for Hugh Everett III, who created the many worlds theory, created something like this in the 50s that he called a geomagnetic entity, a geon, which he said would create its own gravitational field just from this arrangement of magnetism and electricity in this toroidal shape. Toroidal being like a donut-like shape. These sorts of processes eventually lead to what's called condensed matter, Bose-Einstein condensates. And you can create these right in a lab. Now, Bose and Einstein postulate that this sort of matter-like state, where wave-like state, where matter just becomes a wave. It's discovered in 95 at NIST in Boulder, but it's at super cold temperatures. And I happened to run into the guy that was an expert in this, Chen Chia Chen, in a coffee shop there in Boulder once. He said, no, it was only pulsed. It didn't even exist for very long. It was microseconds. And he figured out a way at CERN to keep this going. This is called coherent matter, where the matter becomes a coherent wave-like shape. And the reason it's significant is because it can be turned into type of technology, coherent matter wave beams, something very much like a laser, coherent light, right? Creates this very coherent, luminous type of directional light we call a laser, because all the photons are at the same frequency. The example of this that you're familiar with would be murmurations of birds, where the birds sort of all fly and turn at the same time, which scientists have a hard time explaining. That's in a kind of a classical analogy. And this is a patent from Lockheed Martin, where they propose creating coherent matter wave beams for cloaking and teleportation and invisibility and directed energy weapons. It's a type of matter that's created by subtracting energy from the system until all the particles are at the same frequency. So it's the opposite of the way you and I normally think about things, not adding more energy to generate more energy. Subtracting energy until all the particles are like the birds or the school of fish, and they're all kind of doing the same sort of thing. And that's coherent matter wave beams. And the thing about coherent matter wave beams is it's governed by the Aharonov-Bohm effect, which means you can control it at a distance. We're talking controlling things at a distance. Communication at a distance. Hello, RV. We're talking about. non-local communications in the absence of quantum entanglement. It's a type of frequency driven interaction where particles can become like a wave. And it's an outcome of quantum mechanics, but again, it's not discovered until recently. Coherence, AB effect. And this is what we were looking at with exotic vacuum objects, ball lightning, and so forth. These types of phenomena have been seen, and this is from declassified CIA reports, up in the atmosphere. And there's debate about what these are. Tom Bearden, now passed away several years ago, speculated this was Soviet scalar wave technology, but other people have disagreed with that. John Ramirez, you've heard him talk on these podcasts, former CIA missile analyst, I believe, said that these were types of stealth plasmas coming in from the outer atmosphere, UFO related. He's talked about this with John Greenwald and other people. So this type of coherent matter wave beams can create a lot of interesting effects. Now, it turns out that this sort of research has been going on for quite a while in many different countries in a classified form. This research that was uncovered by Zverbelis in Moscow in '88 was from a classified, he said it was a classified KGB experiment that he was just invited to look at. And what he saw was a device that could create an invisible ball lightning that you could measure with an oscilloscope, that even if you shut off the equipment and remove the equipment, it would stay there for 2 days in the desk. The dark plasma would stay there. And the device that did that was this sort of wrapped multi-level toroids that, kind of like a bagel shape. But you can see it's got a fractal pattern to it, right? Because there's windings on top of the windings. And at some point, it condenses matter in a way that creates closed electromagnetic fields. Again, the opposite of the sort of open, expanding electromagnetic fields that you and I are familiar with from Maxwellian EM fields that create radio waves and so forth that go outward. What Zverbelis and his partner Nevesky argued, his mathematician friend, is that this creates an inward-facing fractal Maxwellian shape, an extension, a fractal extension of Maxwellian electromagnetics, where the pointing vectors are now closed and it doesn't expand out. Normally, the EM fields are at 90 degrees to each other. But if you create this toroidal shape, you can have magnetism and electricity going around in a circle, and then more circles on top of the circle. You kind of get the idea. And Zverbelis and Nevesky argued that this is goes all the way down to the quantum vacuum field and creates these sort of ball lightning type, persistent ball lightning type objects that were invisible. And that the only shape in the universe that could explain it was the Koch snowflake fractal. When I saw this, I really couldn't believe it, having studied this a long time ago. And then this turns out to be the key of creating closed loop sustainable energy systems. I had an artist sort of recreate what it looks like, but these are closed EM fields. And what I'm arguing for here tonight is that a lot of these phenomena are based on this sort of fractal closed field. They don't radiate outwards. They radiate inwards, smaller and smaller and smaller, with loops within loops. Kind of, you remember the fractal phantom toroid shape I showed you from Bob Greenyer that he just spontaneously intuited from doing this research. Well, Zverbelis and Bob Greenyer never met, but Zverbelis called it an electromagnetic phantom, which sounds to me like a lot of the phenomena we're talking about. That was their term for it. It was there, you could measure it, but you couldn't see it, and it persisted for several days. I think they said 4 days after the experiment was shut off or something like that. And that's what researchers in this ball lightning have discovered. Micro ball lightning, it can persist for days. I think the record, if I'm not mistaken, is several months in Soviet Russian research. Persistent ball lightning that buries itself in metals and just stays there waiting for 4 months. Isn't that incredible? And it's based on this sort of fractal structure. So this is why I'm saying to you, and I know I'm saying a lot of information tonight, but You can see it kind of comes full circle. Fractal shapes are the key to creating sustained, non-destructive energy fields based on the universe's distributed energy in the background quantum field and in charge clusters and so forth that naturally exist. It's not in an outward linear form, 90 degrees and so forth, which is what Maxwell knew back in the 1860s, 1870s, and 80s. It's a closed fractal type of structure that creates a whole new type of technology. And the mathematician Nevesky that Verbus worked with to try to figure this out, they concluded, and both of them are no longer alive, unfortunately. But we're thankful for the scientists over there in Russia that sent this over to MFMP because they saw there was a big similarity in the research. Nevesky even speculated that electromagnetic fields like this that are based on spiral shapes interact with living matter, which makes you think of chi energy, that this is the basis of chi, because our DNA is in a spiral shape. And there's this continuity of energy through chi energy, which I was never sure, having studied it in college, Tai Chi and Qigong practices for many years, whether it was just a way of thinking about energy or whether it literally existed as its own field. But this really convinces me it does exist. You can feel it sometimes, but what is it? It seems to be this type of vacuum energy, charge clusters, but condensed. And it creates this toroidal moment shapes and so forth, which is just an extension of Maxwellian electromagnetic fields. Think of a focused donut, okay? And it creates all these interesting effects, including this Aronoff-Bohm effect, which seems to be responsible for why RV can work, and other very interesting effects. The Aronoff-Bohm effect being what's in the Lockheed Martin patent. And this information came out to some degree with the folks that participated in the To the Stars Academy. Remember this in 2018, around the same time that Lorien and I were at the UFO MegaCon? This had just started up there. You had Hal Puthoff and Lou Elizondo and Chris Mellon, Steve Justice, and Tom DeLong's there, and several other, former intelligence people who knew about these programs. They decided to say as much as they could without breaking their NDA. And here, at what Lorien was talking about before, we had Hal Puthoff talk about his experience. He said, I've never talked about this before, but I was after the RV program, in the 70s and 80s, I went on to work in UFO research for the federal government. And he had worked in OSAP and the predecessor to ATIP. You've all heard about this by now. And Hal told us that based on their analysis of these UFO materials, this is the only one he would talk about because, well, I did ask him about the others, and he said he can't talk about those. There's your NDAs. This is just one of many metamaterials that changes the permittivity of space. So it's doing something similar to this type of technology we're already talking about, in my view. It's part of the same family of phenomena of technologies that can create coherent matter, interact with the quantum vacuum field. In other words, the propulsion system of this UFO would be literally making the quantum field denser behind it and thinner ahead. It would directly affect the quantum vacuum by affecting the permittivity of the space it's in, which directly affects the speed of light. And because the speed of light is determined by permittivity and permeability, the electrical constant and the magnetic constant, and normally they're set to 1. But if they oscillate or vary, like Hal is telling us, and some of the cold fusion researchers, Shakparonov from Russia, and others have said that their materials would have oscillating permittivity, which would lead them to be blurry. And how many times have you heard that the UFO photos, how come they came out blurry? Where's the good photos? Why do they always look blurry? Why do these creatures look blurry? Photos of Bigfoot looks blurry. Because if you have oscillating permittivity, your eyes can't focus on it the same way because the speed of light is literally changing back and forth and your brain can't interpret it, and neither can your camera. It doesn't look crisp anymore. And this is what people report. And this is the basis of this space-time metric engineering. Anyway, this is what Lorien and I heard. And then when we went to Bigelow Aerospace, we asked questions about these materials, didn't we? I certainly did. And that's because the New York Times had.
And I have to interrupt because they couldn't shut me up. I kept going, but wet.
Well, good for you, because when I asked some of them, they just made fun of it. They said, we don't comment on the media. And then they said, well, those materials are all around you. But we were told in that New York Times article, Lorien, from December 2017, the article that broke everything open in UFO research for many of us, right? Got the discussion going.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know, Helene Cooper and Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kane, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And they said there was a facility at Bigelow Aerospace. So we're on this tour 6 months later. I think it was a reasonable question, right?
I thought it was, but my guy wouldn't even look at me after the fifth time I asked him.
I turned to someone in the room and I asked them about this, and they said to me, what was the response? I said, they made fun of it. And this person said to me, I've been in the room.
Exactly. And I'm going to tell you privately another story just to make you feel better.
Okay. So we heard and we heard about it again recently in an interview. They said it was a vacuum sealed room in case the organisms got out, they wouldn't get into our atmosphere below ground at Bigelow Aerospace. So we were close to it, Lorien, and that
Exactly.
And they were not clear. I mean, I think it would have been a good 6 months after. They could have talked about it. It would have been mentioned, but whatever. Maybe they couldn't legally talk NDAs. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, yeah, because, there's
NDAs.
3 people that used to work for him that I've talked to, and one of them was a very good friend of mine who just died. And he said to me, and I'm going to go on record saying this in this video. He said to me, Lorien, I can't tell you a whole lot about what I did with Robert Bigelow because he will sue me into oblivion. So, and I have a whole presentation on backstories about Bob and people that have worked for him. So I know.
Okay, so that's why they weren't talking.
Oh yeah, they won't ever. None of these people.
I have spoken to engineers that have worked for other companies, Lorien.
Yes.
Even recently, back on the East Coast, and I got updates from them, and they had said the same thing. So I asked them more about this, and they said they were absolutely certain that beyond the materials they were working on, that there were NHI materials at this well-known U.S. corporation, and they couldn't tell me anything more than that because they used the same words you just used. I'm telling you, it's the same feeling. Sued into oblivion. They said 10 times, and after that, then the damage would start. Then they'd really start. They were afraid, and this is what Lukatsky and Kelleher said the other day in this interview on this European EXO technology channel podcast. They said we can't, and they worked with Bigelow. So that's what we're dealing with here. I mean, it's a serious situation because I'm telling you as much as I can about this technology, just what's publicly available and what I've learned from MFMP and other sources. But the people that have worked with this obviously can't say anything, which is why we're playing catch up right now. And the danger is that we could have a Sputnik moment, right? A Sputnik moment. So let me finish up with the slides here. You heard Chris and Mellon talk about their feeling about this threat from NHI. I mean, just you look at the list of possibilities here. You've seen slide 9, this leaked slide from his laptop about their ability to create anomalies in space-time construct, penetration of solid surfaces, like Tic Tacs, Nimitz incident, psychotronic weapons. You can see there's a big overlap here. There's obviously what I'm telling you about tonight at the public level, and a lot of it's from other countries that don't have these classifications. I haven't worked in these programs, so I haven't signed any NDAs pertaining to this. That would affect my ability to talk about this. But people who go far, actual engineers and physicists that go much farther than me into working with this can never talk about it again. So it's something we really have to resolve here. We won't make any progress as a society. In any case, just going back to these toroidal shapes, they seem to be built into our bodies too, like fractals. In this article by Ray Bolt, he talked about the brains of fruit flies being built around toroidal shapes, which give fruit flies the ability to detect the Earth's magnetic field, navigate like birds do, just with the magnetic field, something you and I can't sense directly. So this seems to explain a lot of these phenomena in these portal areas. And this is my final set of slides here is, we'll look at Bigfoot too for a moment, how this connects. All of these types of luminous objects you see, whether it's at Marley Woods, which was studied by Ted Phillips, J. Allen Hynek's assistant. Remember Ted Phillips with all the trace case analysis? I think he had hundreds and hundreds of these trace cases, US and Canada and other countries. One of these places that Ted Phillips, before he passed on a while back, he gave these presentations to the Ozark Mountain UFO Festival and talked about these amber objects, these orbs over Marley Woods, southern Missouri. And it looks very similar to what we see at Project Hestel and the way they jump around. And these are not UFOs the way we think of structured UFOs. I mean, people like David Freiberger and other researchers believe these are naturally forming condensed plasmoid type objects from their proximity to maybe minerals in the soil or location on the atmosphere to the Earth's magnetic fields and so forth. I mean, I wrote to the Project Hestel and people, they gave me permission to use these photos to show to you and other groups. I mean, you would think in the absence of this presentation tonight, UFO, right? But it's ball lightning, or call it Earth lights if you want. That's fine too. Mobile luminous object. It's part of the same family of coherent matter objects where the attraction, the electromagnetic forces are so strong, it creates this state of matter that creates its own luminosity, its own anti-gravity effects, its own mode of propulsion. And this is why it does blend into UFO research. If you looked at this in the absence of this lecture tonight, you would say, UFO, right? Triangular UFO. That isn't the conclusion of the people over there. If you look at the sequence of events, it's a type of Earth light, ball lightning, orb, whatever you want to call it. Different colors. This is natural stuff. You get this over Browns Mountain to some places in North Carolina, the Marphalites, Texas, things like that. Skinwalker Ranch, other places. MFMP have found these crenellated iron-rich spheres where ball lightning has been, where it's impacted the soil. You find these spheres. You found them in micrometeorites and so forth. So this is one piece of physical evidence you could look for. I would be searching for these at Skinwalker Ranch as evidence of ball lightning being there. And it creates these very, interesting cuts and straight lines in materials. Again, this is happening at a kind of a quantum transformational level. It's at room temperature. This is not from, when you look at this material, it looks melted, right? It's from room temperature lab produced EM fields. There's no temperature change. It's well below the melting temperatures. It literally transforms the materials. In this case, what Grenier and others found is even if you took something like a 10 yen coin and exposed it to HHO gas, you could get these cut marks and these melting, something that looked melted, but way below the melting point of that particular metal. It's an electromagnetic effect, just like Hutchinson found. And at a recent conference near Alamosa, Colorado, I proposed that this could be responsible for some animal mutilation cases where you find these straight line cuts and these burn marks. It's consistent with this type of process. And that they were very kind, the Snippy 24 people, and this was private conference, but it'll become public in the future, were very kind to give me their own footage with multiple cameras that's on my YouTube channel, talking about the cases of ball lightning injuries, instantaneous evaporation of metal rings and necklaces of people coming in contact with ball lightning. And it looks similar to many of those cuts that you find on the cows and so forth. I'm just saying it's another possibility to look into. Very similar to some of these marks left from UFO trace cases too. It looks sort of like, doesn't look kind of similar. Here's the micro scale. Here's the macro scale. Could be similar processes at work. Other people have talked. There's a researcher, Nikitin from Russia, and Louis Jaitner, who calls them condensed plasmoids. But he says They can damage biological tissues. They can go through solid objects. If they're charge neutral, they can go through a wall and not even affect it at all. So you have to take proper cautions. But I'm showing this to you because it seems like magic what this type of matter can do, because it can form a wave-like state. It can become coherent, it can become condensed. And it seems to be something that we could be using in technology, and perhaps people have already used it before. That's my feeling about Bigfoot and cryptids. Seriously, is that this is a type of life form that knows how to create coherent matter using sound, cavitation. They're extremely loud. Howl growls that people say are deafening, makes your clothing vibrate if you're next to it. But strangely enough, people 100 feet away couldn't hear it. The people who heard it said it was louder than a freight train, that howl. You know what I'm talking about. You can find clips of this on YouTube or listen to podcasts. But someone away can't hear it. What do we call that? Coherent sound. Just like a laser. You can point it one direction, won't see it unless there's a lot of dust. You see, someone would see it over there. Someone over there won't see it. It's like a laser, but made of sound. Coherent sound. And I think they're creatures, as much as I've been telling you tonight that Lockheed Martin, that this is something developed in technology, coherent matter wave beams, using any type of matter, not just cold matter like this did, and the types of, I think, rubidium atoms they used at super cold temperatures. The Lockheed Martin patent says we can do this with any particle at any temperature. I think these creatures already know how to do this. And this is my study into Bigfoot, was talking to researchers. I tell you how it started for me just briefly is my remote viewing students in Boulder talked about seeing Bigfoot because they were natives to Colorado, seeing them in the Rockies. Telepathic experiences with Bigfoot. It didn't turn out to be some relic ape. It turned out to be some sort of paranormal human, ancient paranormal human that's still with us, in my view, that can create coherent matter, coherent sound. People have described it going into orbs, coming out of orbs. I'll show you evidence for that in a moment. But looking at this map at the Bailey Sasquatch Outpost, I mean, there we were in the Front Range, and I thought, oh, this is some rare, relic ape from the, another time period in the Cascades, and there maybe, like we heard on Coast to Coast by Art Bell years ago, his cryptozoologist, 1,500 of them in the Cascades. They're all over the world, all over the United States. They're extremely good at hiding or being not visible. And this was the map just in my area, in your Boulder, sightings, footprints, wood structures, vocalizations. I didn't realize it was that close to modern civilization, but they're right there. They come right up to suburbs. At the first conference I went to, I heard these stories from Don Monroe, who's a researcher, and Igor Burtsev, who's from Russia. And Igor talked about invisibility. He said they call it hominology in the Soviet Union, a respected area of study. They thought it was like a very rare primate, but then they realized it could talk and vocalize and do intelligent things like a human. So maybe it's an undiscovered human, like a Neanderthal that still existed. But he had too many stories of invisibility, of it going invisible in front of people's eyes. And the story he told us that happened in someone's yard in the suburbs of Moscow was exactly what I was told just last year up at the Kalispell Bigfoot conference held by Dave Paulides and Joe Hauser. And I just run into a person who had said, I've never been to, talking to someone you see in the hotel there first night. And this person, she said, I've never been to a conference in my life. So I asked her, well, what made you want to come to a Bigfoot conference? Because I saw one, she said, as a teenager in my grandparents' property north of Missoula, and it went invisible. I said, what do you mean? She goes, it digitized. I said, you mean pixelated, like Star Trek transport? Yeah. That's what Igor Burtsev, she doesn't know Igor Burtsev. She had never been to a conference. She had never talked about it to anyone before. She'd held on to it for decades. You see, I'm talking about hidden events. Igor Burtsev said the same thing. Curtain of light came down, 9-foot tall creature disappears. I've talked to many people who have seen this happen, seen them go invisible. But I mean, none of us were. This is the strangest part of these phenomena. It says we weren't taught to believe in these things, but you're talking to witnesses who said they saw it from Russia to the U.S. It's the same description. They can create some sort of coherency in their matter to become transparent to light. Or how are they doing it with sound, with energy? But they're doing it. This is what they used to think Bigfoot was. I mean, Grover Krantz, my WSU, Wilson Hall. They thought it could be Gigantopithecus. There's no evidence of Gigantopithecus outside of China, except for millions of years ago. They only found one jaw piece. That's it. And they reconstructed the entire animal. They thought, well, Gigantopithecus is on 4 legs. You know that Bigfoot does. Walks around on 2 legs. And you know, there's no evidence it ever showed up here in North America, but that's the best that those researchers could do a couple of decades ago, just arguing to their colleagues in anthropology or, you know, physical anthropology that this even existed, looking at the footprints. We've all seen the Patterson Gimlin film. I saw this in the 70s as a preview to a movie in a movie theater taken by, you know, Bob Gimlin, James Patterson. And Bob Gimlin is still on the circuit. You can still talk to him. He was just at the Yakima Bigfoot conference last weekend. But I mean, this is clearly something walking on 2 legs, guys. It's not a Gigantopithecus. And they, you know, it's still one of the best films that we have. But just 2 days ago, I said, oh, Bigfoot sightings, Orbs magazine. What? Bigfoot sightings are, this is the typical clickbait title, right? Bigfoot sightings are almost always this animal in disguise, a biologist explains. And of course, what does this biologist tell us? That almost all Bigfoot sightings are misidentifications of bear. Bear on 2 legs running at 60 miles an hour that can throw boulders with precision and howl louder than a freight train. Are you kidding me? Has this person ever even talked to one witness? I mean, come on. This is what the issue is, folks. We're dealing with attempting to understand this reality we're around and this newer technology, older technology, the fusion of coherent matter. And that this is the best that our media can do, is say, you talk to these witnesses, they say, I know what bear look like. I've been around bear my whole life. This wasn't a bear, okay? Bear do not do what Bigfoot. I've seen bear stand up for a few moments on 2 legs. They don't run and walk, and they don't articulate English. There are recordings of Bigfoot talking to each other from the Sierra Sounds, and there's a new movie coming out about it. I'll show you more about that in a moment, about the Sierra Camp in the 70s. You remember that the Sierra Sounds and that kind of reverse chattering sound, the reverse samurai sound? They have their own language. Scott Nelson, the Navy cryptolinguist, who, you know, I see he was up at Kalispell. He said his specialty was working for Defense Intelligence Agency or Navy intelligence with Arabic, Russian, and Spanish, taking coded cryptography and trying to understand it. He said he just wanted to listen to these recordings of Bigfoot. He said it's a language. There are syllables there. I mean, that is not what you get from, it's ridiculous, these modern articles. So here's an example where Barb Shoup, who's a researcher in Western Washington, you know, this video is online. You can search for this particular words and see. They saw it with their eyes, but the camera just got a predator shimmering like effect. Very strange. They could see what looked like a small chimp jump down from a tree and go away, but the camera just records a kind of a shimmery blur. Very interesting, suggesting a different type of matter at work here. I went on Bigfoot Adventure Weekend. Our group was a couple miles from this group, maybe 2 miles. They saw something that was quite tall, and they had some clear images of it. So you can go out and go to areas where they are. But the interesting stories to me are the electromagnetic nature of Bigfoot, which suggests an entire different level of biology than we're used to. In this case, there was one case from one of Rusty Wilson's books. You can look his books up on Amazon, Fly Fishing Guide, that records stories from his guests. I mean, these people, they were skinny dipping down here. One of them was a park ranger. It was like sort of in the winter when it's technically closed. A wildlife sound recording specialist and her partner, who was a former national park ranger, and they go down to this boiling river in Yellowstone. And this thing comes out that's glowing blue, and the guy begins to kind of lose consciousness. It was like emitting sparks, and it affected him. And she had to help him back to the car. And when they got to the car, of course, it wouldn't start. And this thing bent down and looked, and they said blue light emanated into the car again, suggesting a non-ordinary electromagnetic phenomena going on, like trailing sparks. And often these creatures have glowing eyes. I mean, red, yellow, blue, greenish yellow. Eyes that emit light, like they have their own power source in there that's emitting a frequency that they can, strange, pick up again with their eyes, like their own internal infrared. This person wrote me. I've just given you one or two examples before we get to questions here. Quite a good time here. We've been talking. This person, Barbara, wrote on one of the interviews I did, and she said she was with the Smithsonian doing a dig in the 70s with 3 other guys. And when I interviewed her, it's on my, this is the link. You can listen to my interview with Barbara. They were out at China, China Lake Naval Weapons Station, off limits to the public, but Smithsonian got them access. And they go in their tent for the nights, 2 people per tent. And she feels something reaching through the tent, feeling her face like a huge human hand. And she kind of said, "Hey, what's going on?" And all 4 people left it. 4 people, they all go out and look. And she said it was a 9-foot tall, dark-haired adolescent Sasquatch with glowing yellow eyes on a moonless night. Again, eyes that emit light. It's making you think of these non-ordinary EM fields that create their own self-closed loop fractal toroidal moment. That's what it makes me think of. And she said it was the longest 30 seconds of her life. It just stared, and eyes were mesmerizing, and then it just gone. And the next morning they see footprints in the snow. They don't sleep much. They're back to back in one tent all night. They leave at 5 a.m. They get up, and their footprints, and they don't even take any pictures with the really good camera. She says they don't even know why they didn't take pictures. It was like something was affecting their mind. So here's a witness, the glowing eyes. It's just fascinating. So here's one of the final stories I'll share with you. So this is from the movie. It's on YouTube, A Flash of Beauty, Paranormal Bigfoot. Now, it came out of the Resonance Productions group, Brett, Jill, and Mike in Portland, and they had produced this first film called Flash of Beauty, Bigfoot Revealed, which I had seen before I met them. But they heard so many of these paranormal stories of orbs and other telepathic effects and strange EM effects, batteries failing, cameras failing. They decided to create a second documentary called Paranormal Bigfoot. I'm in it, by the way, talking about these sort of ideas. And this is, by the way, they've put it on YouTube and they've had the original interviews with some of the witnesses. And this was one that really blew my mind. These 2 guys on their way to their construction company, which the guy on the left, I think, is the owner, Harold, they saw a Bigfoot turn into a glowing orb and then a cube as bright as the sun. And you can see this if you go to the Flash of Beauty YouTube site. You can see this interview with them. I mean, they see it by a telephone pole. It crouches down. At first, they think it's an elk standing on 2 legs, but then they see it's a huge ape-like creature standing way up there. But this is why I'm including it in this discussion tonight. It condenses and folds up into a fetal position and turns into an orb that turns into a square, they both saw this, and shoots off into the forest. No footprints, no signs. You think something standing there that big would leave footprints. No footprints, no physical evidence. And they found this artist who they had bought a picture from in the area in Cokeville, Oregon, southern part of Oregon on the coast there, had sketched it for them and drew a picture. And it's in the movie, and you can see it in this little sub piece that they put up on their YouTube channel. But it's just fascinating. So here is just another example of 2 witnesses of an orb Bigfoot connection. And this is a square. Have you ever heard of anything like that? A glowing square? So, finally, this is what Ted Phillips found at Marley Woods. I showed you one photo of those orbs. These strange creatures. They had these creatures that showed up one time that were seen by multiple people. They couldn't figure out what they were. Kind of cryptid-like creatures, like a cross between a polar bear and a dog. And I think the rancher shot at it, but they turned red, but they didn't affect them. And they walked through a barbed wire fence and left some hair. They walked through a barbed wire, huge creatures like that weighing hundreds, but walked through 3-wire barbed wire fence, just through it. They didn't go over it like Bigfoot does. Left this hair. Left these 3-toed footprints. That's the footprints. Really, they measured how heavy this thing would have to be to leave footprints like this. Your dog doesn't leave footprints like heavy creature. But how do they go through fences if they weigh them? Again, my feeling is they're dark matter, coherent matter, the types of things we've been talking about today. Matter that can take different forms than we're used to. And Katie Page talked about this. It's another case from Elbert County called so-called Rocky Mountain Ranch. When she was growing up there, I think she lived there for a few years on this ranch that's mentioned in Hunt for the Skinwalker as another portal area. Same sorts of things, the orbs, UFOs, strange boxes showing up, disappearing, trees disappearing. Interestingly enough, voices out of nowhere talking to them in air inside the house. Katie showed us an example of new military technology that's based on coherent sound, where they can direct sound on a laser beam into a crowd. They'll hear it over there, but no one will hear it over there. Coherent sound. Very much like what Bigfoot does, or some of the other cryptids, where it'll be projected. People who I've talked to who've been around Bigfoot and have heard the sounds felt like they were projecting fear onto them, like a wave, just as a defense mechanism as they left to keep from being followed, because it gets turned off again like a switch, kind of like this technology she's describing from the military. So Katie, who was at the Snippy 24 event, talked and showed us examples of this house and just things that would appear, just sounded just like Skinwalker. I'm just saying the same creatures, the same types of UFOs, same types of sounds, orbs. So finally, we did have this quote from John Brennan where he said, there is some type of phenomena that's a result of things we don't understand yet. And we could say it involves a type of activity that you might say constitutes a different form of life, which encompasses a lot. And this is from former director of CIA saying, there's phenomena out there that we don't understand. It's a different form of life that to me sounds like what we've been talking about today. Types of life based on coherent matter, just like Ken Shoulder said was possible. Finally, there's also this show, which I'm part of this one too, The Mysteries of Bradshaw Ranch, by Alan Margula and Ron Meyer. And it's about the Sedona Ranch and the strange effects all around there, and the battery failure and the camera failure. There's so many commonalities here, and they talk to me about coherent matter and so forth. So this is also on YouTube. So
can I start the questions? I'm so excited.
So one thing I'm just going to summarize, we call this this is from ball lightning researchers. They call this overlapping phenomenology. It's not a dirty word. It doesn't mean you don't know what you're talking about. It means you can't distinguish between the intelligent life and the natural occurring phenomena. There's a spectrum. I don't totally understand it myself, but this is what the evidence suggests, and this is what T.R. Durrani, the Hessdalen ball lightning researcher, came up with that term. So we can see between fractalness and coherency and permittivity changes, there's a whole other type of reality that we're next. So thanks for listening, folks. I know there was a lot to listen to, but I appreciate your attention. And in the remaining time we have, let's have questions or comments, agree, disagree, whatever.
Oh my God, you have no idea. You've turned everybody on their head. The chat room's been going crazy.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up some of the chat. Let's see if we got some questions in there. I wasn't able to do it during the presentation because I can't have it all on the screen while I'm showing the audience. So, okay. So I'm going to, for those of you left in the chat, I know a lot of you had to leave, but for those of you left in the chat, just start typing your questions in capital letters so I can find them. That would be wonderful. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Simeon about something that's dear to my heart. Yes. Because it all came up during the presentation today. And that is the scene in Phenomenon, the movie by James Fox, where Jacques Vallée is talking to Gary Nolan. And Gary says, I took a piece of the craft and I put it under an electron microscope, and none of the molecules are like they are on Earth in this dimension. And I emailed Gary and I said, Gary, why are we still here? Why didn't your lab explode into oblivion?
Yeah.
And here's the answer to that, because I knew it before I asked the question. There's some kind of containment field around the ships, the phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, that keeps those molecules from turning into a hydrogen bomb that we don't understand. Now, my question to you is, do you think what you've discovered here with the electromagnetic energy field, do you think that's what's containing this stuff when it comes into our dimension?
It could be, Lorien. I'm in the updated version of Black Swan Ghost that came out a couple months ago. I have an a description of a well-known computer engineer at a conference who told me he had analyzed such material himself for some organization. He was being deliberately vague. He said it was 1,000 years ahead of our technology, at least. It was manufactured at an atomic scale, which he goes, I know because I was involved in computer manufacturing. We can't do that yet. We can't assemble electronics atom by atom. We don't have the technology to do that, right? We have to use the same micro electronic masking techniques Ken Shoulders came up with. And it's just a little closer now together. But 3 nanometers, I think, is the limit now for newer chips. But this guy, over a couple of days, told me everything about these materials that he could. And he said they worked by, directly interacting with the quantum field. So that the hull, he said he had a 3-piece of a hull. I mean, we're really getting close to classified stuff here, but he told it to me. He never authorized me to share his name, but he knew he was talking to someone, and he had signed the NDA. But he told me this. He said he thought it could have been from Roswell, but based on the 3-foot size of this is not a little piece. Like we've heard of other people like the bismuth, magnesium. This is this big. And he said, based on the curvature, he estimated it was 80 to 100 feet across. He said it was manufactured in a 0G environment, and the isotopic proportions of the chemical elements were not from this part of the galaxy. He goes, they were the wrong isotope ratios. We don't find those on Earth. They were from something like 1 million years older than us. You wouldn't find those isotope ratios, proportions between the different chemical compounds. There's different isotopes of these materials naturally found, like carbon has carbon 14 and 16 and different carbon 10. And you find certain ratios on our planet. But he said these were not from what you would find here, which led him to believe 100% conviction it was extraterrestrial material. And he said, he told me what it looked like. And I have the pictures, by the way. In Black Swan Ghost, I have the pictures of what the material looked like. I'll describe it to you. But I drew it.
Yeah.
He said it looked like 5 wires moving along parallel, and they would change in thickness. They would get thinner and thicker together at a nanometer scale. And they would occasionally wrap around a hexagonally shaped structure and continue on their way throughout the entire hull. It was very thin, but that was the propulsion system again. It was a quantum type of, what Hal called space-time metric engineering.
Do you think it could be organic in not in the sense of our organic, but do you think that structure is a particle of life? Do you think that might be, because we know the ships are they're telepathic with the people in the aliens inside of them, that they talk to them. They communicate on a level that is very similar. What you're talking about, the Bigfoot, that connection that they have with,
Yes. It's an interesting question because I can't answer it directly, but people who have been around these craft allegedly have said, I've heard this on more than one occasion. I heard about a crash retrieval in Arizona from someone who just asked a high school buddy when they saw each other again after graduation, who was in special forces. He joked about UFO retrievals, and the guy said, no, I really did one. And he said it felt like it was aware. The last day before they left, and this is a very remote part of Arizona, unfortunately, no one showed up because they had shoot-to-kill orders if they saw anyone approach that area. That's how critical our military sees that technology. They don't want it getting into the wrong hands. And they never saw anyone so remote, Arizona out there. But he said the last day they got to go up and peek their head in a hole that was in the side of the hull. And he said, got this feeling like he shouldn't be there, like it felt sentient. But, this is very serious topic, and it's serious, Lorien, because anyone involved with it is in this NDA black hole, not a Matsumoto condensed matter black hole. It's a black hole of non-disclosure that is serious enough that Kelleher and Lukatsky said they don't care if they're given immunity by Congress. It doesn't overrule their NDA.
That's right.
And I've spoken to these people who've been in these programs, and most of them I've never shared their names. I haven't even put them in my books when they asked me never to mention it again because of the consequences. One guy said, if I hid in the deepest forests of Siberia, they would find me. That's how serious this is. It's technology, next generation technology, way beyond our carbon-based propulsion systems, that anyone who develops this first has a huge military advantage. Unfortunately, that's how they're looking at it.
Then let me ask you this. Our secret space program.
Yeah.
We've already got there. But do you think it's the aliens that are doing it? Or do you think we have even the capacity to understand how they fly that big black triangle that flew over my head?
No, it's a good question. I don't know how developed that space program is. We don't know how much of it is this disinformation that they also put out to cover their own research, maybe to intimidate adversaries. It's hard to say how developed that is. But when I asked someone who had been in OSAP point blank about this, because I go to these conferences, I said, how developed is those what are called alien reproduction vehicles? He said, not that developed. That was the response. They just haven't totally figured out. It's still at the experimental stage. So
I think that
I don't know. I just don't know. I'm not enough of an expert. I'm sure people that do this full time. I know that these programs exist, and even Lou Elizondo has said on these recent podcasts, and he's been more outspoken than anyone else. He wrote Imminent, and it's a fascinating book. He said, I can't say anything. You heard him say this just 2 weeks ago. I can't. Yeah. Lou, you're so close. What? He said, I can't talk. So we know this is drop dead serious stuff. Even this broadcast that we're doing right now, we're right at the edge of real secrets. I don't personally know anything more than I've told you tonight. I've been totally open what I know. And who's ever shared it with me has felt it was important to share it. Yeah. But I do know having talked to a guy named Phil, and that's also in Black Swan Ghosts. He said, I don't care about the NDA. Phil, I know from the Colorado area, goes to conferences.
Yeah.
And he said, no, I'm going to tell you what I know about it. It comes down through NASA, through special access programs within NASA that the public doesn't know about, and they farm it out to JPL.
Yeah.
JPL farms it out.
and everybody else. Yeah. Yeah.
JPL gives it to all the aerospace contractors. This is why Schumer, eminent domain, we want to get it back. They know what's going on. JPL farms it out to aerospace companies, and then there are these different groups. I've heard about these people from these groups. They get a piece, and they're told, we can't figure it out. The people who made it left, can you figure it out? And it's this big or it's this big. And I haven't spoke to anyone who said they could figure it out, because it's like giving a laptop to someone in the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Yes,
the light would come on the screen, but they wouldn't. There's no internet there. There's no plug-in power. You see, it's sort of that analogy. So I'm told 1,000 years is the difference in our know-how. And it's a game changer, whoever figures this out. Now, our bent would be, can we figure this out for peaceful purposes to reduce pollution, have more abundant energy and resources without destruction and entropy and greenhouse gases and all the things that come about from the negative effects of industrial life, destroying the ecosystem, destroying the oceans. I think the rest of us who don't think about these military security issues or are not involved with that are thinking about, my sense of security is planetary security, about not destroying the ecosystems and biological diversity, which is going down at an alarming rate. And that's why we should develop this type of technology, because it's non-destructive, abundant technology that doesn't have to create toxic pollutants and forever chemicals and things that we don't even know the effects that are going to be. So that's my point of view on it. I realize the military intelligence community, when I talk to them about this, sometimes they say, listen, the reason you sleep safely in your bed at night is because of our special access programs, especially at Area 51. That's why you go to bed at night and don't worry about waking up the next morning, because of what we're doing with our SAPs. And they're probably right. They are. You look at what's going on in the world right now. I'm not disagreeing with that. But even people like Elizondo and Chris Mellon said there has to be some balancing point where there's public discussion, so that democracy doesn't die on the vine, because democracy is based on accountability and, checks and balances, and that requires a certain degree of transparency. And these people themselves have told me that the net result of these programs is lack of information and understanding, because once you've signed those NDAs, you can't talk to anyone about it. Even in your same program, you can't talk to the person at the other desk.
The guy next to you can't even know about it. I know.
So you come up against it. You want to figure out the nanotechnology. There's nowhere to go, which is why Hal Puthoff ends up submitting those 30 DIRDs, as they were called, those defense intelligence directives. Remember, with OSAP to hide the fact. That's what he told us at the conference you and I were at. He created as the science leader at OSAP, right? He wanted to find out what's the best state of knowledge to tell if these materials are manufactured on Earth or are they NHI. So you put out these proposals for what's the state of the art in that field, in metamaterials, metallic glasses, topological insulators, all these sexy condensed matter physics topics, right?
Yes.
A whole variety of topics, right? Medical effects of plasmas.
Oh my God, yeah.
But nobody knew they were in a UFO. It was a UFO project. It was just and they got the best experts at the time, right? 15 years ago, to let them know the state of the art. And that's how they had to do it, because of the classification. So the danger here is we have another Sputnik moment, because other countries, and I was at the citizen hearing in 2013 at the National Press Club, and you had people coming from Latin America, from those militaries, people from China, and they were more open about it. Maybe you get what I'm saying. You know what
I mean, it's just it's
bad science. It's bad science, and we can't have security at the cost of bad science.
Well, we're not making the progress we could make if we could all share. Let's just put it that way. I know we can make great progress, but it is what it is. Okay, we got to get to a couple questions, and then we
please
can
do.
good
I'm happy
night.
to-
Because here we go. Okay, David asks, can the good doctor comment on potential collusion of our military with the aliens? Do you think they're doing it? I do.
Could be. We heard about the tall whites from Charles Hall was it Dog Lake area in somewhere in Area 51, that area where he said,
Right.
He gave us I don't know if you were there, Lorien. He gave a presentation at the Laughlin
Yes. I was there. I was
International UFO Congress. He sounded pretty credible to me. I mean, I don't get the feeling he wasn't sensational. He talked what they looked like. They were almost human. They were good at some things we weren't. So this could be true. I ran into someone recently from the Vegas area. We're just talking at a conference, and Cosmic Summit conference over in North Carolina a couple of weeks ago about, ancient technologies, and the thunderstorm generator demo was there. And we're just talking, Vegas. And, oh, by the way, my dad worked at Area 51. He had something happen out there that disturbed him. And he finally told me before he passed on. It had been bugging him for 30 years. He was asked to go out with an electrical engineer to a remote location on Area 51. And it was a building surrounded by a barbed wire fence, a small building, suggesting that it led to underground. He goes, whatever opened that door was not human. It didn't look like us. It had bigger eyes and no nose. And it spoke telepathically into both of our heads. And it said, only one of you can come down. Which one of you wants to come down? We have this issue. And the electrical engineer went down.
Wow.
And the dad swore that this is not, it was telepathic. The eyes were bigger and there wasn't any nose like we have. There were just two holes. And he thought it was a non-human that was good at being in desert conditions that might do better than a human. Out in extreme conditions, guarding an important access point. And this is just a couple of months ago I heard this. So, I think he said even 30 years later, the dad still felt traumatized by that. And people, by the way, talk about this with Bigfoot too, of something projecting its voice into your head without moving its mouth.
Oh yes, I've had it happen, so I know how weird it is. It's not for the layperson. Let's put it that way. You got to kind of been indoctrinated. I do know a woman in Las Vegas she played with the tall white's children. Her dad was based out there, and 4 or 5 of the kids were allowed to interact with the ETs. Mm-hmm. It's a long story, and she's just starting to come out with it. She's a little afraid.
So this is what I think why disclosure is slow. I imagine, given the lecture I gave you tonight, it's not just life forms like relic life forms native to Earth that are different matter that are a little weird to us, invisible. I think that it's pretty likely that the extraterrestrials are already here and they're blended into the human population. And
isn't that what Bob Bigelow said on 60 Minutes?
Yes. So those of us on the call right now, okay, you might even be shocked by that, thinking it's neighbors or something, or maybe not because of your exposure to the topic. But think of the average person. How would they react? I mean, maybe there's no control over this. They've just kind of blended into it was Sergeant Major Robert Dean. Remember Robert?
Robert and I were very close.
The Schaeff report at Brussels. And one night the guards come to him and say, you want to see this report? And they show. I asked him. He said the appendix was this thick, and
that's right.
They didn't know if this human-looking. He said they looked exactly like humans, but they weren't sure if they were humans or ETs that were mimicking humans. That would be kind of scary for some people. How would you know, people in your life, what if they were human or not? I mean, it would change society pretty overnight. It would change the outcome of an election.
Yeah, it would, wouldn't it? Well, here's something very interesting in my life is that, David agrees they are among us. So there you go. That's the answer to that question. But I really do believe that many children not children, people my age in their 60s are products of hybrid program that's going on.
Yeah.
I really do believe that now. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, I would have said, no way. But what I've been through in the last 20 years, my brain is guaranteed that it is a reality. That there is something going on where they're trying to figure out how to become us or us become them. And I don't know the reason why. I can't figure that out, but maybe it has to do with our intellect. I'm going to tell you a quick story. The gentleman that I was very close to that did work for Bigelow at one point, and many other projects, by the way, that I can't talk about, that he wouldn't talk about. I did get, you know how they can insinuate something if you ask the right questions. I did get a lot of that going on. And the people listening in on this from the DIA or wherever, I never told anything. Okay. All right. Now that we've got that cleared up, I will tell you about his ET experience. He had a gray ET ask him to come very close to his eyeball when they were in communication. And he saw what looked like little tiny caviar eggs all smooshed together to make that black surface. And the ET said to him, the reason we have such a problem communicating with you guys is because you've got two spheres of your brain. Every one of those little caviars in my eyeball is connected to a brain sac about 1/5 the size of one part of your lobe. And I've got hundreds of them. And they're all interconnected like a neural network, and we're all connected to each other, and we're all connected to the ship. Wow. That's what he told him. So think about that for a while. Isn't that wild?
I think the reason progress has seemed so slow in this whole area for the couple decades, I think a lot of us thought in the 90s it was just about to happen, right? The disclosure.
Yeah.
It's because the truth must be really, shocking in some way. You might have just said something right now. You've immunized us to that, because when we hear it again, Lorien was talking about that. But imagine the average Joe Q public, their level of mentality, and they won't believe this, and they'll just, it could cause a type of psychic shock. Exactly. In the same way but back then at Copernicus time, when people realized the Earth wasn't the center of the universe, Galileo was going in that direction, and Copernicus had proposed this, and Galileo proved it with his telescopes. Well, he sort of showed that it didn't explain what he was observing with his telescopes. But that was kind of a shock, but that took like 50 years to wear into people that the sun was the center. Even Copernicus wasn't totally sure when he passed on if this was just a model or if it really worked this way. And that took decades. But nowadays, it would be boom. So I think this has led to greater degrees of classification. I'm not making this up. This is what the Robertson panel concluded in 19.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
Didn't they? That whatever it was, it could be exploited by the Soviets to create instability through jamming the phone lines from panic with even pretend UFOs. So they had to dumb it down so that people weren't interested anymore. And that's what we've been experiencing for 70 years, is this legacy of the Robertson panel. If you don't believe me, listen to what Rick Doty says.
Oh, yeah.
On Disclosure Tonight, on that podcast where he's often a guest. I interviewed him right there when we were there at MegaCon, and he told me the same thing. It's on my YouTube channel. His job was to play up the UFO angle to make it seem almost unbelievable, so you weren't guessing what the Air Force really had at Kirtland, which were very advanced drones, which no one knew about at the time. So you called them UFO. but he was creating this disinformation. But he was the first one. When I asked him, well, I said, "What's the truth?" He goes, "Oh no, it's all real. We just couldn't tell people at the time, so we just."
Exactly. I'll never forget. It was so cute. Rick Doty came up to me at that conference and said, "Lorien, do you think anybody would care if I sat in on an experiencer group?" And I said, "Well, are you an experiencer?" And he just smiled at me and said, "What do you think?" I thought that was so cute because I think he is an experiencer. After all he's been through, I don't think he has a choice at this point.
Yeah, no, he is. And he said right there at that lecture that you and I both heard that he at Paul Benowitz's house, an orb came through the wall.
That's right. That's right.
And was hanging out. And he said, "Paul, what is they going?" Paul said, "Oh, those just show up all the time. Those are just, my ET friends or something." And Rick said he saw it. So, I mean, this is like, we were talking about this. This was it natural? Is it some intelligence? Where is it on that spectrum of?
We just don't know anymore. We're going to have to close out here because I think.
Yes, it's fascinating.
You and I could probably go on for 6 hours because that's what I do with all my buddies in the UFO field. But I think everybody else is.
I'm sorry if my voice was a little hoarse. It's from COVID about 5 days ago that I got over, but it has these kind of lingering effects.
It does for about a month. It just kind of does.
Yes,
yeah.
But the good side of it is I think you're immune now. Your body's getting stronger from recovering.
Yeah, you got the COVID of the year, so now you won't
got the COVID of the year. So if you forget about the flirt variant, I guess that's what it's called for the rest of the year.
Yeah, exactly.
Get a hall pass.
Yeah, you do. One last comment by David is gray blood is copper based. Hybridization between humans and grays is an impossibility, though, from what I know. Programs in this area can continuate. Yeah, are continuate. Yes, there we go. Okay, I'm trying to remember what that word means. My brain has gone south on me all of a sudden. But that's okay. I'll figure it out. Well, that's interesting, David. You and I are going to have a chat about that next week when I see you.
Yeah.
There we go.
I just want to say thanks for listening to everyone who stuck it out here. And
yeah, we have a few that stuck it out.
It was a lot of material, and if it doesn't all make sense, I mean, it took years for me to grasp all this, listening to many videos from MFMP, but they made sense. They're a nonprofit. Their job is to explain this to the public, go through decades of research. And it took me several years to explain what I just explained to you. So rewatch this. I'm going to post this on my channel.
Great.
Rewatch it, or you're free to contact me if you need any more resources. And the MFMP have a great YouTube channel.
They do. They're
Bob was just on the Matt Beal Limitless podcast.
Oh, really?
4.5 hours sort of explaining. I'm not endorsing every idea he says, but he goes through the same sorts of references I went from the different researchers. And so interesting, the threads are working in isolation. I just want to say one more thing about this. These people don't necessarily know each other because they're using different names for the same phenomena because they're each in their own country and thinking, does anyone else know about this? And they don't even know what to call it, but it converged on the same stuff, which is just very interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is great. Well, thank you, Simeon.
Okay, thanks a lot, folks.
You've been amazing. You always are. I love having you when you get all excited about presenting something.
You too, Lorien. Okay, thanks. We'll talk again soon.
We will. And Time Travel Con is going to come up again in a little bit. So you're on.
I learned so much from that conference. I started reading. It's fascinating. Just fascinating.
Oh, good. I'm glad you did. I'd like to inspire even the speakers. I got to say one thing about myself. I very seldom do. But the events I have, all the speakers come back to me, even the UFO cons and the time travel, everything. And they say, Lorien, I learned so much at your conference from the other speakers that I knew nothing about. It's kind of fun. I love it.
Very fun. Very fun.
Yeah. Okay, dear. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, folks. We'll see you next time. Take care for now. Bye.
Bye-bye.